San Francisco Planning Commission and Building Inspection Commission joint hearing for Thursday, April 12, 2018. I will remind members of the public that the commissions do not tolerate any disruption or outbursts of any kind. Please silence your mobile devices that may sound off during these proceedings, and when speaking to the commissions, if you care to, do state your name for the record. I will take roll for the Planning Commission. Commission President Hillis.
Here.
Commission Vice President Melgar.
Here.
Commissioner Fong.
Here.
Commissioner Johnson.
Here.
Commissioner Koppel.
Here.
Commissioner Moore.
Here.
And Commissioner Richards.
Here.
And for the Building Inspection Commission, President McCarthy,
Here.
Vice President Walker,
Here.
Commissioner Gilman,
Here.
Commissioner Constant,
Here.
Commissioner Lee,
Here.
and Commissioner Warshell,
Here.
and Commissioner Clinch is excused.
Very good. Commissioners, we have your special calendar, two combined items, 1A and B for demolitions and fraudulent plans, fines, and penalties.
Thank you, Jonas. Good morning, President McCarthy and Hillis, and members of both commissions. I'm Liz Waddy, Deputy Director of Current Planning. Thank you for calling this joint hearing today. It is certainly timely, and we are looking forward to having the opportunity to discuss the challenges that we are all experiencing with demolitions and major alterations, and to collaborate on working towards a productive solution. Joining me today in delivering this presentation is Chief Building Inspector Pat O'Riordan. We are also joined by Acting Zoning Administrator Corey Teague, as well as Dan Lowry, Deputy Director of Permit Services, Ed Sweeney, Deputy Director of Inspection and Code Compliance, and Joe Duffy, Senior Building Inspector. Today's presentation will cover the following topics. We have four primary items that we would like to cover: an overview of the current demolition regulations, a discussion of field inspection processes and issues, dialogue about unauthorized demolition processes, including penalties and fees that currently are in place, and our general key takeaways of what the major issues are that we're facing. So, as all of you are probably well aware at this point, the city has a handful of demolition controls. And before we dig into what we see are the challenges, we wanted to first go through a little bit of a technical overview. Although normally I try to stay clear of this kind of technical jargon in any type of public presentation, I actually think it's very critical for the transparency aspect of what are we actually dealing with to really set the stage of understanding what the challenges are. So first, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This is the building code definition of demolition. Chief Inspector O'Riordan will go into this a little bit more, but it is important to know that the building code does have a definition of demolition, and that is something that, again, Pat will go into in a bit of more detail. What I'm going to be focusing on here is the planning code definition of what we refer to as demolition. Technically, the planning code states that there are two different ways that a project can be considered demolition. And as at least our planning commissioners know, once a project is considered a demolition with residential units, it's subject to a conditional use authorization typically. So the first way is if DBI considers it a demolition. The second part is what I'm going to focus most of my presentation on, and that is when an alteration permit is considered tantamount to demolition in the planning code. This is often referred to as tantamount to demo or 317. There are two ways that a project can be subject to tantamount to demolition. Those two ways are highlighted on this slide. Each of the two ways is a two-part clause. Each of them is an and clause. So you have to meet both parts of the clause in order for a project to be considered tantamount. So for example, the first one, lineal feet at the foundation level, removal of more than 50% of the sum of the front and the rear facades, and removal of more than 65% of the sum of all exterior walls. You need to meet both in order for it to be considered tantamount under the lineal calculation. The second way is a square footage calculation, a surface area calculation. And that similarly is a two-part clause. Removal of more than 50% of the vertical envelope elements, so your traditional exterior walls, and more than 50% of the horizontal elements, think floor plates and roofing. The key in this definition that we're currently, that is in our code right now is the word removal. Removal is akin to demolition. So what is removal defined as? It's defined as, with reference to a wall, roof, or floor, the dismantling, relocation, or alteration of its exterior function by construction of a new wall exterior to it. This is just a quick graphic to highlight what dismantling or relocation means. There's a sidewall on the right-hand side that's taken off and it's put back on. That's dismantling or relocating it if it's shifting it by a couple feet. This is a graphic demonstrating building a new exterior wall. So perhaps they kept their old exterior wall, made it an interior wall, and built a new exterior wall to it. That would also constitute as removal. What's equally important here is what is not removal under the definition of tantamount to demolition. And this is, I think, one of those challenges that has resulted in a lot of consternation by members of the public and a lot of public perception issues, to be perfectly honest, when you're in the field. So this part of the definition that's in our code says that when an exterior element of the building is removed and replaced for repairs and maintenance in like materials, with no increase in the volume of the building, it's not removal. So in practical terms, if somebody is in the field and they discover that an entire exterior wall is termite infested or has serious dry rot and it needs to be repaired, the developer can take that wall down, put it back up with fresh exterior materials, and that is not counting against their demolition calculations. That is our current code language, and obviously there's a dialogue and a conversation that has to happen for that to be reviewed and analyzed between the building inspector and the planning department, but that is allowed under the current code. Again, this slide is a little bit for visual effect and a little bit for some technical information. There's a lot on this page that I'm not going to go into, but the gist of it is this is what we do in the planning department when there's a project that comes in with a lot of demolition. We do our demo calculations. Most of this information is information that we ask the architect to provide us so that we can determine whether the project is or is not tantamount to demolition. So this first slide aligns with that first definition, the lineal square foot removal. And in short, the top aspect of this slide, the front and rear facade requirement, you'll see on this is effectively the foundation plan footprint. It demonstrates that the front elevation is removing part of the foundation, 22 feet specifically in this table. The rear elevation is removing the entire facade. That's a total of about 78%. The threshold here is 50%. So as the part one of the clause is, yes, so far it's looking like a demo. You then go on to part two. You look at the total of the foundation, how much of the total foundation is being removed. In this example, you'll see that most of the sidewalls are actually staying intact and aren't being removed. So as a result, when you calculate everything, it's a 49% removal on this. The threshold for demolition is 65%. So because they don't meet that second half, you don't have a yes answer to both parts of that clause. This project is not a demolition under the first criteria. So we go on to the second criteria. It could still be a demolition based on the surface area. The information on the left is relating to the horizontal calculation. The information on the right is the vertical calculation. With experience working on this, I always train our staff, start with the horizontal. It's an easier calculation. If it's no after doing the horizontal, it's not a demo. So we're gonna take that same approach here. So on the horizontal calculation here, you'll see that the grand total is 45.5% removal. And that equates to the picture at the bottom left where there's a little bit on the second floor on the right-hand side, highlighted with a red box just for ease of quick review here. Bits and pieces on the third floor, and then the entire roof is being removed. So that grand total of 45.5% removal is under the 50% threshold. Since it doesn't meet the first part, we don't even need to go on to the vertical surface area calculation because it doesn't meet one of the two clauses for demolition. So all in all, this project, which is doing a lot of work, is not a demolition under tantamount to demolition. I do also think it's important to just take a quick step back to acknowledge why the tantamount to demolition controls came into place. These controls came into place about a decade ago for many of the same reasons that we're facing today and some of the same challenges, some very things that don't make sense in the real world or based on sort of a common sense perspective, and we tried to put consistent regulations in place that would solve and to acknowledge the policy objectives of that existing housing is more relatively affordable housing and to preserve neighborhood character. So those were really the intent of the policy going into it. And I think it's very, again, timely that we're now looking back about a decade later to really assess, were those policy objectives met or were they not? So moving forward, from the planning department's perspective, there's a handful of challenges with our current regulation. I'm going to touch on three of what I consider to be the biggest challenges. The first is that there's a very strong market incentive to be an alteration. Once you're a demolition, as I said in the beginning, you're pretty much, with a few exceptions, going to be going before the Planning Commission for a conditional use hearing. That significant process difference between just processing an alteration permit, which is handled at a staff level, and a commission hearing, equates to a significant amount of time, money, and uncertainty in the outcome of the process. Secondly, the regulations are not effective. Again, going back to those policy objectives of preserving relatively affordable housing and preserving neighborhood character, we certainly don't feel like those are being addressed through this specific policy. Similarly, as I went through that example, on most typical San Francisco homes where you have a zero lot line building, if you keep your sidewalls, you're rarely going to be considered a demolition when you go through the calculations. That results in this public perception issue. If you keep just the sidewalls when you have a zero lot line neighborhood, you're seeing entirely through the building. It doesn't look like anything's there, but technically, again, as we went through those demo calculations, you're not meeting the code rule that we have to follow for implementation. And lastly, we really feel like in the planning department, at least, there's a misalignment of roles and responsibilities with the current demolition regulations. The demolition analysis is that responsibility is placed onto our staff, and planners are not experts regarding construction methods or building code requirements. We have our own expertise, but it's really tough when you're putting our expertise pitted against what a lot of the building inspectors and plan checkers really understand how buildings go together and how you can build them in the field. And so we'll kind of come full circle on that at the end of what we see as some of the direction that we would like to move forward with. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Pat O'Riordan.
Thank you, Liz. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Patrick O'Riordan. I'm a Chief Building Inspector at DBI. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to both commissions for giving me the opportunity to present on behalf of DBI on this very important topic. Cyril Yu, who is a structural engineer at DBI, will also be a contributor in the presentation. Firstly, as Liz did, I'd like to emphasize the challenges presented to DBI in regard to the inspections we perform on these projects. Existing walls are often deficient in weatherization, fire resistance, structural, and seismic. Must be upgraded throughout per code. Electrical, plumbing, and HVAC work is required. And I think what's really important is when we have shoring that's required to preserve walls, floors, and roofs to comply with the demolition calculations, this can often lead to unsafe conditions for workers who are working in the area of the shored components of the existing building. Demolition calculations are determined by the architect and approved by planning. Site permit often approved without building code items being completely vetted. There's a disconnect between architecture and engineering plan sets. It's normal to have unexpected field conditions, for example, dry rot, that would require additional demolition and may, with the filing of a new permit, even trigger a conditional use hearing at planning. Continuing with the inspection perspective, vertical additions. Building permits for vertical additions are the most common source of unauthorized demolition. An estimated 4 or 5 instances of exceeding the approved demolition are substantiated annually. Substantial structural upgrades of the building's bearing elements is needed to support an additional story, or sometimes maybe two stories, that is. Means and methods to add upgraded structural components are required from time to time. Unanticipated conditions, again, such as the dry rot we previously mentioned, are found at initial approved demolition. Roof or partial roof removal is required to facilitate adding the story, which gets into walls needing to be braced and shoring, etc. In regard to some of these items, I'm going to turn it over to Cyril Yu, who's our DBI engineer, and he can speak to some of the structural considerations, which is very important in regards to how these vertical additions have to take place and how buildings are put back together and added to. Cyril?
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, commissioners. My name is Cyril Yu. I'm an engineer with the Department of Building Inspection. Today I'm going to go over some of the technical construction challenges with substantial alteration and vertical additions. As you can see, majority of the residential remodels these days and alterations, we see a push for like the open concept floor plan. This poses the biggest compliance issue with Planning Code 317. There are restrictions and limitations from the planning on alterations of these existing walls or exterior walls. The problem the stakeholders have is they spend, a bunch of money, millions of dollars on the remodel or whatnot, and they end up with a non-code compliant building if these existing walls are left unaltered. So some of the building components that are affected are the waterproofing, the fire protection, and also the structural integrity of the building. In regards to weather protection, that's governed by San Francisco Building Code Chapter 14. Section 1403.2, performance requirements for weather protection. Exterior wall shall provide the building with a weather-resistive exterior wall envelope. The exterior wall envelope shall be designed and constructed within the wall assembly, providing a water-resistive barrier behind the exterior wall. As you can see from the diagram or picture from the top left, that's a code-compliant weather-protected wall assembly. You have your exterior siding, which is the exterior veneer, right? After that, you're supposed to have building paper and flashing with the sheathing. Then you have the stud, insulation, vapor barrier, and your interior finish. So on the bottom is an example of exposed exterior wall of an older building. You kind of see the dilapidated and extensive dry rot due to insufficient weather protection. So what the contractor did was basically sister in new studs to strengthen the existing wall. In this situation, the contractor did their due diligence, what they can, in situ without removing the wall. However, this is still not a code compliant, weather-protected exterior wall. Next, I want to talk about fire protection, specifically fire protection exterior walls. This is governed by San Francisco Building Code Chapter 6, Section 602, fire-resistive rated requirements for exterior wall based on fire separation distance. Example I'm going to use is your typical two-family dwelling, non-rated wood frame building, 3 stories. Bottom, you have the garage stores. You have each dwelling unit on each of the upper floors. So if you look at on your top left, Table 602, fire-resistive rating requirements for exterior wall based on fire separation distance. Because typical San Francisco, we have 0 lot lines. Your fire separation distance is 0. And because this is a residential occupancy, your minimum exterior wall property line needs to be 1 hour, needs to be a 1 hour rated assembly. So on the bottom left, this is what a typical fire tested and approved 1 hour exterior wall assembly looks like. You have your stud, you have your insulation, and you have basically 5/8 type jib board on each face of the studs. So your minimum fire protection per building code exterior wall cannot be achieved if these existing walls are left unaltered in older buildings undergoing renovation. Here is to your left is a picture of your typical existing exterior wall assembly. Although the contractor did put in new stud walls, you see the long-term effects due to improper or inefficient weather protection from dry rot, wood siding, and deteriorated building paper. Basically, this could potentially lead to health issues from, mold infestation or growth within the cavity walls. It's impossible for the addition of jib board at the exterior face of the stud wall without alteration of the existing wall. This becomes a life safety, fire protection issue. It's impossible for the addition of continuous overlapping building paper at the exterior face of the stud wall without alteration of the existing wall. This becomes a building performance and weather protection issue. So next, I want to talk about the structural requirements for substantial alterations. So picture to your left, basically this is a demolition plan which shows the demo of some interior walls, to open up the kitchen and enlarge the bathroom. This appears to be a simple and basic kitchen bathroom model, but this can actually turn out to be a substantial alteration. Existing structures are governed by Chapter 34, Section 3404.7.2, structural alterations. This basically says that if 30% of the tributary roof or floor area affects a structural component in your building, that kicks you into Section 3401.10. Okay. Section 3401.10, lateral force design requirements for existing building, kicks you to code Section 1604.10. And then 1604.10 basically requires a full wind and seismic detailing of your entire building per ASCE 7. Okay? So the point to take away from this is the 30% rule. If you're doing a remodel and affects any structural component of your building by 30% tributary to your roof or floor area, you have to provide a full lateral strengthening of your entire building. Okay? So example I like to use is a simple third floor kitchen remodel that becomes a substantial alteration requiring a full lateral strength in the entire building. Again, I'm going to use a two-family dwelling, wood frame, non-rated building, numbers three stories. So you look at the picture on your left. This is existing condition, idealized existing condition of a building. You're trying to open up the kitchen, so it's open to the dining living room. 50% of your load goes to the interior wall for tributary area, and the exteriors take 25%. So hypothetically, let's say we get rid of that interior wall. Now you have the bottom left condition where then the load gets transferred, distributed evenly into each of the walls, so 25% to each of the exterior wall, right? So your load increases from 25% to 50% of the exterior bearing walls, right? So that's 100% increase of the loads for those walls, so which is greater than 30%. So that kicks you to full lateral strengthening of the entire building. So what do you need to do? So you need to, for this kitchen remodel, well, you need to strengthen the existing exterior walls. So here you have a picture of the contractor doing work. What they did was they doubled up or they tripled up the studs of the exterior walls. They sistered 2 new studs to each of the existing studs. Potentially, this could you have to strengthen the studs all the way down to the ground floor, and this might potentially lead to a foundation upgrade as well. So these walls need to be exposed, to basically run the electrical and plumbing associated with this kitchen remodel. The problem with that is these are both considered unlawful demo by definition of Planning Department 317 because we're not doing repairs, we're actually upgrading these walls, right? So the structural integrity of the existing wall is unable to be achieved. The existing walls left unaltered per Planning Code 317. Next example, it's a vertical addition. This is a substantial alteration due to vertical addition. The example I like to use is your elementary physics principle, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, right? So the acceleration or the ground motion or ground shaking of your building, that's subject to the location of your building, the proximity of your building to the fault line, you're basically what type of soil your building sits on, right? Some like bedrock, that's less subject to shaking, whereas if you have sand or clay, that's higher subject to shaking. So basically, when you add if you add that additional structure on, if you add that addition on, that increases the mass of your building, which actually increases the inertial force of your building that has to be withstand. There's a direct linear relation between mass and lateral force exerted onto your buildings. So with a vertical addition, it involves strengthening with the entire building. So the picture in the top left, basically you have to consider not only vertical components, which is the gravity, how do you support that addition onto your building and strengthen your existing building to support that addition, and also the lateral component too, because you're adding more mass to your building. So how do you strengthen the rest of your building to actually hold up that new addition? So the vertical addition involves exposing majority of the building to strengthen the skeleton and framing of the building. So that's practically unachievable without altering the existing building envelope. Again, considered unlawful demo by planning. Bottom left, you see a picture of a new moment frame installed at the ground floor. The ceiling of that is exposed, the walls of that exposed to basically connect that moment frame into the skeleton or to the framing of your building to make it a coherent building system. So in summary, basically it's practically unachievable not to alter existing walls and substantial alterations or vertical additions to obtain a full code-compliant building. So I wanted to be clear that full code compliancy, people talk about, oh, my building's full code compliant. That's great, but again, these are just minimum standards by the building code. And minimum standards, these are the bare bones for life safety and building performance, right? So stakeholders spend all this money on a remodel addition, and they still end up with a substandard building because it doesn't meet code because of the restrictions by Planning Code 317. So you end up with insufficient weather protection, insufficient fire protection, and insufficient structural integrity of the building. So, in the interest of public safety, I feel like there has to be a compromise on the restriction of Planning Code 317 and the minimum life safety and performance requirements of the building code. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. And those are just the fundamentals of the building code that Cyril put in front of us right there. So there's a lot to it, and the intent is to have a good, safe building, code compliant, fire resistant, and weatherized. That's what we do as building inspectors. DBI's definition of demolition. The San Francisco Building Code 103A.3.2 under definitions states, demolition, the total tearing down or destruction of a building containing one or more residential units, or any alteration which destroys or removes, as the terms are defined by the building official of the Department of Building Inspection, principal portions of an existing structure containing one or more residential units. And it goes on to define principal portion as the construction which determines the shape and size of the building envelope, such as the exterior walls, roof, and interior bearing elements, or that construction which alters 2/3 or more of the interior elements. San Francisco Building Code 103A.3.2. This here is an example of a demolition where the scope was exceeded back in 2006. It was deemed to be an unlawful demo by DBI. The picture on your left shows the condition of the building 2 years later, 2008. And again, the picture on the right shows how it was in October 2017. Now, I drove by there last week just to see if it had progressed any, and it's pretty much still like the picture in the slide shows of the October 2017 picture. In regard to these kind of projects, when they're abandoned, we receive a lot of complaints. The initial complaint is about exceeding the scope of demo, but when there's no activity and no progress towards moving forward with the work at the site, we get the complaints about blight on the neighborhoods, the impact on the neighbors. We get the complaints about graffiti, which you can see the graffiti in the picture. Roof drainage becomes a problem because they usually tarp these buildings, and God only knows where the water's going to shed. Is it going to go onto the neighbor's side or whatnot? This has been 12 years here. And going back to the tarp, the tarps are flapping in the breeze, and that's another complaint. So this is what we end up with. Unauthorized demolition. DBI and planning work together to resolve complaints of unpermitted work. Penalties are one part of this process. Unauthorized work and work beyond the permitted scope. Now, the current process is DBI performs a site inspection, confirms work beyond the scope of the permit or work without permit. Notice of violation issued, stop work, the site is secured and weatherized. By weatherized, I mean that whatever components of the wood frame building remain, they're required to be weatherized for their preservation or potential preservation. Design team then usually visits DBI for direction. Permit holder is advised to contact the planning department for next steps. That's typically a new permit application with plans, and they're back into the review wheelhouse. In regard to penalties and fees, the DBI portion of this is the stop work order is issued on the project, and it's routed to planning for next steps. The specific penalties for exceeding the scope of the work are based on Table 110A and Table 1AK of the San Francisco Building Code. and the penalty is 2 times the permit issuance fee for work exceeding the scope of the permit. The penalty for when no permit exists is 9 times the permit issuance fee. Now, the monetary penalties are typically small because the valuation of demolition work is not very great, because it's just a few guys going in there and taking down walls or whatever they're doing, and hopefully it's not what they shouldn't be doing. But the penalties are typically small. Code enforcement fees, however, and orders of abatement and assessments bring the penalties up substantially, and then we're into the thousands of dollars. But the code enforcement effort only occurs if they're not being proactive and engaging in the process of trying to get the necessary permit and get back on track with whatever it is they need to do, engaging the planning department and ourselves and so forth. We can have a referral to the city attorney's office for possible litigation and further penalties. The unlawful demolition order prohibits the project to proceed unless they put the building back in the same to the same envelope and the same as it was before. So I'm going to turn this planning portion over to Liz and go back to one more slide before I finish up. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. So on the planning side of the penalties and fee equation, as Pat mentioned, our goal is to seek compliance, not to be punitive, and that's really the way that the code language in the planning code is set up as it relates to enforcement. So in a perfect world, as soon as the issue has been brought to the building department's attention, the applicant comes in, they file a permit to correct, and that is immediately routed over to the planning department. Our first job is to assess, where are we? Is this deviation in scope of work under or over that tantamount to demolition threshold? Plenty of projects are significantly under that threshold, and in those instances, we would review it. We would verify that they are not tantamount to demolition. We would sign off. They could move forward and continue with construction. In those instances where they were right up to the wire on being under that threshold, and this work now pushes them over that threshold, this is where we really get into a tough situation in the planning department. In those situations, we would then tell and let DBI know that work needs to stop. They need to file a conditional use authorization, and they need to go through the planning commission process, which again can often add somewhere in the ballpark of 4 to 6 months of delay while that site is being sort of under a stop work order. What makes things even more challenging are the instances where that building is a rent-controlled building, because now we're going from an alteration of a rent-controlled building, which is something that we typically support, to a demolition of a rent-controlled building, which is often something that we have real challenges supporting. And now the commission has a predicament. They have a project that has already gone through neighborhood notification, maybe without objection, maybe with. In those circumstances, it's halfway under construction, and we're now having to decide whether or not we're going to stick with what we would normally recommend on a project if it was coming before us fresh, or responding to the situation of a project halfway under construction. It's a situation I don't think anyone really likes to be in, that situation, making those decisions. The rest of the items here are in the situation where the developer does not come in to try to correct the issue. So if they're told they need a correction permit and they don't come in to get one, then the planning department can open up its own separate enforcement case. In those instances, we have a very structured due process set of rules and set of enforcement notifications that go out. And ultimately, once those have been exhausted, the penalties can be up to $250 a day. Those can obviously be appealed to the Board of Appeals, and they have a set amount that they can reduce those penalties down to. And ultimately, like the building department, we can refer the most egregious of cases to the city attorney's office.
Thank you, Liz. Now, in regard to possible action steps, require a dedicated demolition page on the drawings that defines the full scope of demolition. That would be helpful, so we could, at least at plan review stage, see exactly what it is being removed and what's being kept. So that's a discussion that's probably being had. Refer structural addenda to planning for review. Give the planning department a chance to see what additional work is being proposed on the addendum to the site permit. Evaluate addenda with site permit to ensure consistency and feasibility. And I think one of the big ones here is require site inspection by DBI at start of work to review permit and site conditions for vertical additions with evaluation of more than $150,000. I'm available for questions when Liz finishes her part of the presentation. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thanks. So just one last slide here. Basically, to wrap things up, we want to acknowledge that this is a tough topic with no easy solution. We've been down this road before, and I think it, again, is very timely for us to take a step back and look at new solutions to this problem through a legislative fix. And before we really, I think we all have a tendency to jump into the technical solutions. And I think before we do that, we all feel like we really need to take a step back and take a higher look at this and establish our real policy objectives. What are we trying to do here? What are we trying to solve for? From our experience, there are three main points of contention that tend to get recirculated around the issue of demolitions, and those are issues of neighborhood character, issues of affordability, and issues relating to upgrading our housing stock, both from a livability standpoint and a life safety perspective. We really need to unpack each of these topics. They do really mean different things to different stakeholders, and we need to gain consensus over what are we trying to solve for around those three topics. And lastly, I think most critically, we really need to establish one shared definition for the city and not have this bifurcated set of rules between two different codes and two different agencies. So with that concludes our presentation. Thank you for bearing with us. I know there was a lot of technical information in that presentation, but we wanted to make sure you guys really understood what we're dealing with as professionals in the field every day. So we are all here and available to answer any questions that you guys might have, and we look forward to getting your thoughts and direction on where to go for next steps. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Waddy. Thank you, Mr. O'Riordan, Mr. Yu. We will open this up first to public comment, and then we'll have commissioner comments and questions. And I've got a number of speaker cards, but all are welcome to speak. If you line up on the screen side of the room, that would make it helpful. Mr. Wooding, you're first. Georgia Schudish, Paul Weber, Jeremy Schaub, Nancy Werfel, Rose Hilson with 2 cards, Spike Kahn, Kathleen Courtney, and Anastasia Yovanopoulos. I think we'll go 3 minutes is our typical. All right, Mr. Wooding.
Hello, my name is George Wooding. I'm the president of the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods. Thank you for having this joint hearing. The issues before you today are what the community has been wrestling with and brought to you for years. We believe that you've seen enough, and it's time now for the community and the commissions to come together to fix these problems. This endeavor requires 1, legislation regarding definition of demolition, 2, implementation, 3, enforcement. The community is inviting you to join us in pushing for all 3 categories of these above fixes. Legislation regarding definition of demolition. There should be a new definition for demolition, and it has to be clear, easily calculable, quantitative, measurable, and live in both planning and building codes. What currently exists in Section 317 of the Planning Code is formulaic, but not easily calculable. Number 2, implementation. Whatever we've done in the past has been open to interpretation and hardly bulletproof, as prior speakers can attest to. This requires specificity so that our building inspectors and planners know what their roles are. The planning and building departments are public agencies, and as such, we expect them to be accountable to the public. The roles and responsibilities of the 2 departments might be delineated enough for projects that go per plans, but when a developer misrepresents the plans or goes beyond the scope of the permit, which department is taking charge of these issues to rectify them? Planners may think it's not their job to fix plans that are not accurate. Enforcement. This is my own personal one, because I have felt for a long time planning has dropped the ball on enforcement and says, well, we'll go to building inspection. Well, when you look at building inspection's rules are so vague, they're subject to almost any interpretation whatsoever. So you have a situation I see where neither agency is able to really work with the other.
Thank you, Mr. Wooding.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitting. Ms. Shudish.
Hi, good morning. I don't know if you read what was in the packet that I sent to your packet, but there were those emails back from January 2015, and I didn't intend those to say like, oh my God, this has been going on forever, because it has been. But no one's really responsible. I feel responsible in a way because I didn't push more for the Planning Commission to adjust the numerical calculations in the demo calcs. That could have been helpful in the 317, but maybe not based on what Ms. Waddy presented this morning is how tricky they are, because you have the groupings. Maybe if they were all ors, that would be good, but it's still arcane. With all due respect to the staff and some of the good-hearted people behind me who during the RET debate also thought that one singular definition of demolition would solve the problem, I completely disagree. If there is only one definition of demolition, what you will have is a lot of demolitions. Clear-cut demos, flat lotting, demos like those that now skirt the rules, not demos like those that skirt the rules now under the current tantamount to demolition. I mean, if you look back in 2007, the reason for tantamount to demolition was to avoid people doing things in alterations. If the goal is to preserve housing and prevent demolition of sound, relatively affordable housing, the city needs two definitions, as I outlined in my handout, which is in your packets. One for planning and one for building, but both staffs need to be able to use both definitions as needed. A revised tantamount definition must be a descriptive definition, one that can be understood by neighbors, by all city staff reviewing a project, and by enforcement. And it must be one that can allow for reasonable alterations. As I said, that was the original intent of Section 317, to prevent demolitions while allowing for reasonable alterations. Prior to 317, you had one definition. Is that what you want to go back to? Why did you spend nearly 8 years coming up with Section 317? Rewrite Section 317. Do not get rid of it. Fundamentally, it should be this. Vertical expansion equals demolition, while horizontal expansion does not. It doesn't matter if building material is replaced or window openings are counted. That should only matter in a strict preservation or restoration of a property. Also, please remove Section 317B7 from the Planning Code. Units should only be merged after careful consideration by the Planning Commission. Otherwise, de facto demolition of second units will continue. That's in the 4th and 5th paragraphs of my handout. But please keep two separate definitions. The one as is currently in the Building Code, and write a new improved one for the Planning Code for tantamount to demolition, as I first suggested in October 2016, and both departments coordinate use as needed. And here's what I wrote in 2016, and on the back are the projects since I wrote the memo in 2015 that I think you ought to look at.
Thank you, Ms. Shudish.
So should be enough for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Weber.
Good morning. My name is Paul Weber, and I'm a resident of North Beach. I have some general comments and then process comments. First of all, both departments must have a common definition of demolition and have a common time for demolition permitting. The activities of a BI should be in furtherance of a common definition. The details which were explained today should all be solving for X, and X should be a common definition. BI should monitor a project to see that the project on the ground matches the application and shut it down for variations. Permit applications, including plans, should be submitted under penalty of perjury. Deviations should be met with severe penalties and not serial amendments to a demolition permit. The definition of demolitions should be formulaic and numeric, not qualitative, and should be objective, simple to apply and understand, so as to leave no subjective judgment in the hands of reviewers. Periodic on-site reports should be submitted by inspectors to senior management under penalty of perjury as the demolition progresses, verifying compliance with the final such report submitted and approved by senior management before construction is authorized to proceed. Now, as to the process. For seeking a conditional use permit from planning for mergers, conversions, or demolitions, the application review criteria must be changed. Currently, they are called considerations, which are a number of different sets of factors depending upon the authority being sought, with no direction as to what to do with those considerations. It just says, thou shalt consider these, and then they're listed up to as high as 20, but it doesn't say what you're supposed to do with them. These findings should be, these considerations should be converted to findings based upon substantial evidence, meaning that they must be met, not just considered. These will need to be hashed out, I'm sure. Not all considerations will be finding, but then should be eliminated. But the following should in all cases be included as findings, and if they cannot be made, the permit should not be granted. Those two findings are that the project is in compliance in all material respects with relevant design guidelines or other controls, and there should be no demolition of any existing unit which is occupied by a tenant or with a 5-year look back, meaning if a tenant has occupied the facility within the past 5 years, that will be a building that is not eligible for demolition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please, Ms. Courtney.
Good morning, Commissioners, and many thanks for having this joint hearing. Kathleen Courtney, Russian Hill Community Association, and a Fable case study for your information. 15 years ago, a project was proposed on Russian Hill to add a 4th story to a 35-foot, 3-story building with 6 rent-controlled units. The building was built in 1917. The plan called for the removal of 4 feet and then construction for an additional 9 feet for a total of 40 feet. When the neighborhood asked how they could verify that the building could be built within the 40-foot height limit, the project sponsors said that they had as-built plans and they extrapolated from the as-built plans. The city planner did not request the as-built plans or any verification of the metrics. When we appealed the process, the director of planning, who was then acting as the planning commission, did not request as-built plans and did not request any verification of the metrics. We appealed further, and there was no request for as-built plans or any metrics. So one evening, a neighbor jumped from one building to the proposed project, lowered a ball of twine to a third neighbor on the sidewalk. We took the ball of twine to the then director of the Department of Building Inspection, who sent Chief Inspector Carla Johnson out to measure the building. And Carla's report was that neither the structural nor the architectural plans showed a building that could be built within the 40-foot height limit. To his credit, then senior planner Jonas Ionin wrote to the Russian Hill Community Association on March 8, 2005, and said, "Thank you for your continued persistence in creating an accurate record of events. Your involvement in the process has prevented the issuance of a building permit in error." Shortly thereafter, the building was sold. The new property owners lowered the building 18 inches in order to add the additional foot. Neither the developer who authorized the fraudulent plans nor the architect who performed the fraudulent plans was penalized or fined. And I got 3 nails in 3 of my tires in this situation. In 2005, Peskin advised members of the RHCA, quote, "Be vigilant in assisting city government to uncover any misrepresentation in applications for construction projects and to assist government officials to require all proposed construction projects comply with the planning and zoning codes." That's the reason we're here today. We have to do something. It's not working. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Courtney.
Good morning. I'm Anastasia Yovanopoulos. I live in Noe Valley. It's been over 3.5 years since the Building and Planning Commission met, and it's high time we discuss this topic. And I suggest that before you leave today, you commit to a date for the next joint hearing. There's so many issues to be discussed between the two of you, and demolition is only one. Okay, I've read Supervisor Peskin's letter to you all. I hope you've read it. And he says there's been a lack of will to do anything about this. So we have to light a fire under you to do something about this problem. Angus McCarthy, when I went before your commission a couple of years ago to request something be done, you said, well, this really isn't a big problem. I get a lot of calls, but there aren't really a lot of unlawful demolitions happening. And I beg to differ, and so do many of the members of the public who come here today. First of all, you've got a building code and a planning code with two different definitions. You've got bad actors who misrepresent their plans. Who's checking them when they first come in to see that what they're saying, oh, this is what we're going to build, even in the case of an ADU that came before the appeals board, he misrepresented. And what they said was, oh, I think a site visit is required here. Why aren't there site visits to check? Why are you just relying on a checkbox that there are no tenants in the building? Why aren't the planners and the inspectors doing due diligence? This is really important. Let's get it straight from the start. Then the as-built, what is actually represented on the plans and what comes out are two different things. And in the process, a building is built that's non-conforming, and who makes off like a bandit? The project sponsor. There's got to be a will, and there's got to be one definition. I agree with Paul Weber. He's got lots and lots of good points that you need to focus on. And I agree that this legislation for demolition is something that has to become law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please, Ms. Hilson.
Good morning. I'm usually not here in the mornings because you always start at 1. But anyway, I am very interested in this topic because first person came up, or second person who came up, said there's Section 317, and it was worked on for years. So now we have two definitions, one for building, and now we have one for planning. If we started with one definition at building department, and it wasn't working, and we created a second definition of demolition at planning, and it's not working, whether you have one or two, it doesn't seem to matter. So it seems like we're back to square one, trying to figure out, well, what would be that definition? Planning, Ms. Waddy was very good in sorting out the definition of demolition at Department of Building, which is it basically falls on the building official. Now, I don't know what that means. Does it mean the on-call duty, the official of Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday? I'm not sure. But anyway, that's demolition at building. Then you got planning, and it was the formula that Ms. Waddy mentioned. That was one portion of 317. Under 317, overhead please, you also have Article 10. So that's the text of Article 10, and it has a different formula for Article 10 buildings. So those are measurements, but we're not talking about them. It wasn't mentioned in here. But I also have a question because there's something that we see here, the code, and there's something that the public doesn't see. And what the public doesn't see is what happens with staff, how they determine these things. I don't know how they determine some of these things. You know, what kind of list do they work from? That process is hidden from the public. So we need to come up with something. If it's going to be a checklist, is it going to be an objective checklist? If it's about structural force, mass, and acceleration, like the DBI people did, I love physics. And so what happened was, okay, so you put a bunch of walls in, and then when you take them out to make this expansive, you know, really open modern space, then you got to put these beams in to take the load. What happens if someone decides, you know what, I'm going to put more partitions in the building on an old foundation building? Does anyone come back to check on the force, mass, and load after people divide up their buildings into 100 units? Probably not. I don't know, because actually in the neighborhood I'm seeing this. I won't, you know, report that, but the other part of it is demolition is also mentioned not in planning code and DBI code alone, but the administration code. Then there's green building code. How does that apply? Then you've got Department of Public Works. When he decides something, what do you do with that? They don't have a commission. So I'm just bringing up some of these issues. And then how do you determine for historic? What's historic? I mean, is there a survey? What happens with Category B buildings that aren't historic? So there you go. I hope you solve this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schaub. And I'll call a couple more names. Pat Boscovich, who's already there in line, Jerry Dradler, and Cynthia Gomez. Welcome.
Good morning, Commissioners. Jeremy Schaub of Schaub Lee Architects. Want to first thank everyone for being here. This is an important topic. I guess my main consideration I want everyone to be talking about today is what is the goal of all these demo calculations, and what are we trying to, you know, what's our end goal? Are we trying to preserve neighborhood character? Are we trying to preserve affordability? Or are we trying to create a lot of process that works towards those goals without ultimately reaching that? So I know the planning department and the building department had been working on a floor area ratio calculation, which I believe is the simplest and purest way of reaching what we want to reach, of having somewhat affordable homes and also respecting the neighborhood character with residential design guidelines. If we spend all of our time as architects working on calculations, and then it turns out that during a site visit or site inspection, the actual scope of the work has to change, then we end up with a serial permit, which is not what anyone wants to do either. So I think if we admit that, yeah, some neighborhoods like Noe Valley or something should be limited to 3 stories, then let's just go ahead and say that instead of couching it in. We can only add X% to a building, or we can only remove, you know, the front bay of a building. It's not ultimately helping if we're just going to piecemeal one building at a time and every stud. So I just want to keep in mind what the end goal is here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Boscovich. And I understand, you know, we didn't have general public comment on this calendar too, and I know there were people who wanted to come kind of speak on broader issues related to planning and DBI. So now's a good time too, because we don't have general public comment on this.
Okay, I'll try to do this in 3 minutes. What is being discussed today is much more than 317 and 103. It's about 2 critical departments working together with the public trust. It's way more than what we're talking about. And if you don't understand it, you're missing a lot of things going on right now. Why do I care? I was born here. My dad was a steel worker. He could afford to live in the city as a steel worker. My mom was a See's candy lady. We lived in kind of crappy government housing, but we could afford to live here. Rent control is critical. It doesn't work great, though. The thing that concerns me is the kids of residents can't afford to live here. I'm housing 6 kids that grew up in my house, in housing that I own. There's something wrong there. It's a privilege, though, because I get to see them grow up. What is 317's goal? I thought it was to preserve affordable housing. It doesn't work. It doesn't. I'm a civil and structural engineer. I'm out there. I see it. It's not working. We haven't killed someone, but one of these days, if we continue down this path, a part of a building hung up in the air as a remodel, which is ridiculous, is going to drop on somebody and kill them. So we got to start up with a new approach to 317. Maybe you want to demo it, then put an ADU unit in, if that's the goal. But we got to rethink this. 103 of the building code, that was there in the 80s. Judy Boyajian wrote it. It was for Richmond specials. People were coming in with an over-the-counter pink, no plans, and they said they were going to remodel the kitchen. They tore the building down, and all that was left was the kitchen. That is what 103 was written for. So now to apply that to drawings that are prepared and they exceed those percentages, which, to be honest, the percentages in 103 make no sense. To apply that to a set of drawings is insane. And in 1999, almost 19 years ago, there was a committee that I was on, along with Supervisor McGoldrick, the City Attorney Judy Boyajian, Cornfield, Bossy, Bonaker, and we rewrote this. So this issue has been here for almost 20 years to rewrite. We need to come up with a better way to do this. And I think we just need to fundamentally start over on the DCP goals, the planning goals of what you guys are trying to do, and restart over on what building department wants to do, and have a coordinated issue between the two departments. I mean, some of the common sense things that have been brought up, and I want to thank Patrick O'Riordan and Liz Waddy. This is not a great issue because there's a lot of controversy here, but we've got to have a pre-issuance inspection by the building department. Nobody gets a permit until that building inspector goes out and walks the plans and makes sure it matches. Not a signature, but actually a physical visit. The architect and engineer has got to sign any drawing showing what you're going to tear down.
Thank you, Mr. Buskovich.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Mary Ferretti Breidinger, and I own 651 Alvarado Street. I would like to begin by thanking you for having this joint hearing to address demolitions. My property was damaged due to people demonstrating a total disregard for the San Francisco Building Department process. Hopefully, by implementing clearer and stronger language, this type of practice will cease to exist. In my experience with the Building Department since 2009, I have come to learn that the building and planning departments do not effectively communicate and have a different set of standards. This defect has created a window for people who wish to be dishonest. Penalties for violations are not clear and lack substance. They lack means of enforcement and clear consequences. When I brought my concerns of misrepresentation to the building department's attention, I was dismissed or told to hire an attorney. I would like to make 4 suggestions. 1, a liaison department be implemented to improve communication between the building and planning department to ensure that they are on the same page. 2, whenever a proposed project requires removal of any part of the building, it must first go to planning, calculations made, and require a 311 notice. If the job requires additional removal of the building, the plans must be sent back to the planning department and the process will begin again. Calculations were never done with 655 Alvarado Street. 3, to discourage deception, any amount of square footage gained by the illegal demolition shall be multiplied by 2, and the proposed project shall be reduced by that total figure, along with no build, no transfer, or sale of the property for 5 years. This will prevent any financial gain from an illegal demolition. 4, if damages occur to the adjacent property as a result of a 3307.1 violation, the project sponsor is to be responsible for the repair of all damages made to the adjacent property and incur an additional 10-year liability of any future damages resulting from the negligence. This will encourage the project sponsor to comply and notify the adjacent property owner in writing and possibly hire a company to inspect the adjacent property prior to any excavation. No one notified me either verbally or in writing of any excavation to be done adjacent to my building, regardless of the violation. I hope that by bringing this to the forefront, it will prevent any situation from happening to someone else. Can I trust that you can come together and fix the problem and allow the residents of the San Francisco chance to begin to regain confidence in the San Francisco Building Department and prove that the system can work? I sure hope so. It's worth a try. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good morning, and I appreciate the time to be able to address you people. I'm not prepared. I didn't even know about this hearing until a day or two ago. I'm just a member of the Unwashed Masses. My name is Tom Schooneman. I'm at 1639 Washington Street. I won't go through the whole story, 3 years of fighting Ellis Act evictions, but in the past 6 months or so, we have dealt with contractor Peter Iskandar, is the owner of our property now, and I have no idea if what he's doing is up to code or not. I assume it is because there's all the proper paperwork on the building. However, I get no information from him. What the information I have got from his people has been misleading at best. I have everything I know now about the building department, planning department. I have been on a fast track trying to learn myself. I've had to go on, dig up the plans myself to find out what's going on. I've prompted 2 inspections to the property, and it's kind of it's fine. No explanation. So coming from my perspective, somebody's going through this right now. As I left my building this morning, the decibel level was over 90 dB. I'm a writer. I work from home. It's kind of hard to concentrate in those conditions. The building is shaking. They have excavated the garage, replaced piers, punched out the back wall. That's been that way since November. Indicated they were going to put in landscaping and just dug up the yard and put construction materials in there. So I guess that's all okay. I don't know. What's the problem here is the public, people that are in our situation, have no idea what's going on. I would love to trust the DBI, and I have to. I have no choice, but I just don't know who to trust. So this is the public speaking to you, so I hope that whatever you can do to make living in San Francisco tolerable again, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Next speaker, please.
Overhead, please. Good morning. My name is Jerry Dratler. I commend the Building and Planning Commissions for agreeing to hold a joint meeting to discuss the development of a citywide definition of demolition. It is my hope the final definition will include the following 3 attributes: a definition of demolition that eliminates the economic incentive for unpermitted demolition, implementation of penalties and fines that are an effective deterrent to unpermitted demolition, and 3, a demolition definition that is clearly and easily enforceable. Revision of the existing code definitions of demolition will not address the problem unless the code is supported with adequate code enforcement. A discussion of code enforcement is not on today's agenda, and it should be. Lack of code enforcement on recent projects where there is irrefutable evidence that a home was demolished needs to be examined by both commissions. I commend the BIC for scheduling review of building code enforcement at 655 Alvarado Street in the May 2018 BIC meeting, and I encourage the Planning Commission to schedule a similar meeting in future commission meetings. Lack of code enforcement is also a problem with heritage homes in San Francisco. The home at 49 Hopkins Avenue in the overhead was demolished. It was designed by acclaimed modern architect Richard Neutra. A calculation is not required to determine the home was demolished. A complaint was filed. A notice of violation was not issued. The Planning Department and DBI failed to protect the architectural heritage of San Francisco. Both commissions should examine why existing enforcement process failed in this case. Unpermitted demolitions and weak code enforcement has undermined the reputation of the planning and building inspection departments. It has also diminished the public's confidence in the building inspection and planning commissions. Implementing public reporting that improves both transparency and accountability is needed to regain the public's confidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please, Ms. Werfel. And I'll call a couple other names: Lisa Fromer, Ozzie Ram, Gary Weiss, and Ryan Patterson.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Werfel. Supervisor Peskin eloquently speaks for me on requesting reforms. I wish to heartily support his proposal to conduct advanced site inspections, to perform pre-issuance inspection of the physical aspects of a project. This is critical to getting some honest assessment of projects that are going to be built, and to be able to determine beforehand if work is going on beyond the scope of work in the permit. You need to determine the truthfulness of a thing called existing conditions. I love that term. You can invent 15 stories as existing, on a one-story house. But if you don't go out, you'll never know that. And it can be built sub rosa. So I would like to make sure that when you have these physical inspections, people understand that you should not be fooling the building department or the planning department with what really is there. Also, I would like to suggest that such early inspections may curtail the way developers hide their illegal demolition behind 8-foot-tall plywood walls built to keep out the prying eyes of neighbors and visits from city officials, who then only leave, this is my favorite, quote, a while you were out notice to please contact us when you return. How insulting is that, to leave a piece of paper on a plywood fence when obviously the building behind it is gone? This is over the top. Pardon me. So, when you have work to repair stairs or add a bathroom, something like that does not require wall-to-wall walls. That should be a big heads up to everybody. Commissioners, you have a serious credibility problem in upholding your own respective codes and laws. Please keep us in the public involved in the resolution of this important issue in defining demolition, so that the future of affordable housing in San Francisco is now going to be preserved with your help. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Khan.
Hi, Commissioners. Great to see you all sitting at the same place. As the public, I just wish that I could get in one place where all the enforcement is between planning and building. The planning map, the little pink one, has little icons where there are complaints. But as the public, which we're partners with you, we depend on you, but you know about these things and you hear the complaints by us reporting. But Commissioner Walker and I, 3 years ago, sent a list of, a couple dozen PDR violations of actual office use. All we did is walk our own neighborhood and wrote down what's on the mailboxes, all the tech companies that are in the PDR map. We sent that in, never heard back 3 years later. So we had a MAP 2020 meeting the other day, and I represent folks in the mission at United to Save the Mission. And we are asking, inside internal documents, you have in planning a spreadsheet that Tina Tam at the Enforcement Department has, and every 2 weeks it's updated, and that's how she assigns which inspector is going to go on which complaint. But I've asked for 2 months for a copy of this under Freedom of Information, and I can't get it for some reason. It's a public document. They want to clean it up. They want to take out the frivolous complaints. I'm not asking them to do that. I could figure that out myself. But imagine if Tina's department at planning and whoever your equivalent enforcement department head in building had one spreadsheet that showed where all the complaints are and didn't require an unpaid volunteer in the public to click on a map for each and every address. I'm asking for a spreadsheet. I think that in itself, with a status report and clickable links, would give me updates as far as, did a notice of violation go out? Was there a response? Everything for every building should be online. but not by each individual address. It should be a cumulative. This is where, such as the development pipeline list is online. Every quarter it's updated, and I know where to go to see where every building project is in the city, listed by either sortable by alphabet, by address, by zip code, whatever I want. This is what I'm asking you as the public. I'm a builder, hopefully an ethical one. In New York City, when I wanted to buy a building and update it, I had to get 10 years of tenant records and get a sign-off by the housing department to show that all of those tenants were not illegally evicted. We can do that here. In Oakland, where I built a building, I had to have the building inspector come before I broke ground to verify that what my licensed architect had signed in a wet stamp was real. They don't trust us in Oakland or in New York. Why do we trust the architects and developers here?
Next speaker, please.
Jennifer Fieber with the San Francisco Tenants Union. We've contacted a bunch of you several times to try to express our concerns for tenants. We are seeing tenants' units being disturbed by decisions made by both of these departments. We're seeing permits issued that are going to affect the tenant's ability to stay in place. We're seeing DBI inspections that fail to catch work being done outside of scope of permits. And when we try to communicate with you guys, we're told over and over that violations of the rent ordinance are not your business, and that if a tenant has a concern, they can get a private attorney to address how they feel wronged. I just don't understand this attitude. We urge both departments to sit down with the administrative law judge of the rent board to learn the rent ordinance, to learn what just cause is. Invite some tenant attorneys so you understand what the courts are saying. You cannot simply trust owners to do the right thing. They're using renovations as the latest eviction trick. Tenants are coming and finding that their apartments have been totally gutted and they have nowhere to move back. So you can't just push it off onto tenants to hire expensive lawyers to deal with conflicts caused by issuance of ADU and seismic permits. It wastes everyone's money. It wastes the owner's money to spend money on architect plans that aren't going to pan out because they violate just cause. So I want to echo Paul Weber's ideas about disclosure of tenant issues going back 5 years, and also insisting on truth under penalty of perjury. I would also hate to say it, I love the ADU legislation and seismic, but maybe a moratorium on that because it is not working. You know, we're seeing this is the latest ruse to get rid of tenants, and I don't know what to do anymore other than just keep sending you guys emails. So thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. Teresa Flandrick with Senior and Disability Action, as well as with the North Beach Tenants Committee. I am so pleased that we are having this joint meeting today. That gives me hope because there are so many problems. And of course, representing seniors, I am seeing them losing their laundry facilities under the guise of, well, we are doing this ADU. This is a great thing, which it is. But you can't take away what is a use that people have had access to and is part of their lease for seniors to remain and age in place at the same time that some laundromats are being demolished or simply closed. It's supposed to be a livable city, and we need to focus on that. I echo also Paul Weber's comments in terms of solutions, as well as what Tom from Washington Street, I happened upon him quite by accident, but because I recognize the owner of his building, a new owner, Peter Iskandar, it would be really good to recognize if there could be a flag for you as planners and as DBI. To those who are bad actors, I like to call them schmucks. But, you know, someone under the guise of San Francisco Affordable Housing LLC who has proceeded to Ellis Act or harass people out of their homes on nearly every single street in North Beach needs to be flagged. the problems that Tom is dealing with in terms of he really doesn't know what is allowed, what is not allowed. Tenants do not receive notices. So again, to flag the bad actors, it's pretty easy when they're serial evictors or, we have the anti-eviction mapping project that has a great website that you can access all of that. I'm sure you could create that for planning when you know that there have been these schmucks who have done many things illegally, gone ahead beyond the scope, things like that, that there is a way to get a handle on this. And I'm just so glad that you are going to work together. I hope this is only the beginning and that we'll see some real action, some real things put into place. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Flanger. Next speaker, Ms. Frommer.
Good morning, Commissioners. Lisa Frommer from Liberty Hill. I'd like to thank you for holding this joint hearing and beginning the process of correcting the illicit and uncoordinated practices that can no longer be ignored. Our current building frenzy has resulted in the destruction of way too many historic and cultural buildings, and these actions were largely preventable. When historic buildings in particular are gone, they're gone. The ornamentation, for example, from the facade of 38 Liberty that was supposed to be used for restoration was found in the dumpster. So again, this points to oversight and inspection problems. Most of us are here today and have come together as a citywide community to offer workable solutions to this longstanding problem of illegal demolitions. While single voices have raised concerns, it's our collective neighborhood voices that provide the majority consensus that's a little bit different. I'd like to address a new legislative solution to define demolition. The old interpretive framework needs to be replaced with a clearly understood, easily calculated, and quantitative definition. It cannot be qualitative. That means subjective. And that's the very problem that's led to so many illegal demolitions. Inspectors and planners need a quantitative, measurable, formulaic, and easily calculated definition to distinguish a demolition from a remodel. Using these criteria, both Section 317 in the Planning Code and 103A in the Building Code should be rewritten into a definition that everyone can easily use, understand, and leaves no room for interpretation by either agency. Demolitions also affect tenant protections. Currently, neither planning or building keeps an inventory of tenant-occupied units. It would be good if that was worked on. We recommend that no residential building can be demolished if it's currently occupied or was previously occupied by tenants for the past 5 years. An occupancy needs to be checked prior to permit applications. We hope that effective changes will result in a process that all of us can begin to trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Gary Weiss. I am the president of Corbett Heights Neighbors. I recently discussed with a senior planner a question I've had about plans getting approved for remodels. In the case of 17 Temple Street, the existing 129-year-old one-story building would not have been able to support multiple additional floors, and yet plans were approved knowing that ultimately the building would need to be replaced to an extent that would exceed acceptable non-demolition levels. 2x4s would be replaced by 2x6s. Waterproof wood would need to replace non-waterproof. He said that planning's guidelines don't consider what DBI may determine needs to be removed during construction. The roof was removed because stories were being added. The floor was removed because excavation was taking place. The rear and front were removed because they were expanding horizontally in both directions. Of the small portions of north and south walls that remained, one was removed a day later. I spoke with Joe Duffy about the minuscule portion of the building that remained, but he was positive that it wasn't being really being demolished. I spoke with Corey Teague last week, who promised that enough of the joists would remain in place to enable it to not qualify as tantamount to demolition. When I showed a photograph showing that only brand new 2x6s were in place, he was still convinced that they were really there. He also said that some walls were removed, would be returned in some cases. I said that until they do, without knowing for sure that they would be returned, wouldn't it currently be considered tantamount to demolition? He then said that the original walls don't really need to be put back, just a facsimile of them. I asked him if he thought that his determination was following the intent of Section 317. His response, probably not. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please. Ms. Rahm.
Good morning, Commissioners. Ozzie Rome with Noe Neighborhood Council. Thank you for holding this joint hearing. For years now, you've been hearing from various members of the public, neighborhood associations, and preservationists about illegal demolitions that slip through as remodels as the planning phase, or were labeled as work beyond the scope at the building phase. Today, you heard from the community again. It's time now for action, a decisive action that involves a three-pronged approach to this problem. For one, we need legislation to define demolitions in simple, concise, quantitative, and measurable terms that are the same in both planning and building code. What constitutes a demolition, be it tantamount to demolition in planning code or what is considered a destruction of a home in the building code, should be the same. I completely understand the explanations of the senior DBI inspectors about the need for retrofitting, the need for putting insulations, fireproofing. That is all valid. My question to you is, when plans arrive at the planning department to upgrade, remodel, add another floor to a 100-year-old Victorian, what should the planning department do? Do you actually think that this is possible without retrofitting, without putting insulation? So what should we do in that case? Building a home is a concise and mathematically driven activity. There's no reason to have different definitions for what a demolition is, and there's certainly no reason for that definition to be qualitative. The demolition should not be at the eyes of the beholder. It is not enough to say we have a vertical addition and therefore it's a demolition. But what about horizontal additions? What about removing the facade of a building entirely? That is a demolition. And for that, we do need to have formulas to deal with it. Then there are the issues of implementation and enforcement. We need the planning and building staff to know exactly what their roles are to minimize passing the buck. The enforcement should be the joint responsibility of both building and planning departments. As part of their job description, the planners should be required to verify the demo calculations vigorously, and failure to do so should be reflected in their job performance. Now, there was something that Paul Weber brought up to your attention, and I want to echo that again. We do need to have findings. When things come to the Planning Commission as part of the conditional use authorization for demolition, there needs to be findings, and one of those findings should be, has there been tenants here for the past 5 years? This is not the opinion of one person. You heard a whole line of people who were echoing the same thing. This is what the community wants. And we are intent on getting it. So we hope that you could join us.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Good morning, President Hillis, President McCarthy, commissioners and directors. Ryan Patterson. As a land use attorney in the city, I have dealt with many issues of demolitions, both for developer clients and for neighbor clients. But I'm here today just as a private citizen interested in bringing some rationality to the laws here. I think there were some great ideas from Elizabeth Waddy and Patrick O'Riordan this morning. I also want to make sure that the broader policy goals are really being impacted by whatever law is reformulated. And as I see it, there are 4 goals that we're seeking to achieve with demolition controls. The first is protecting rent-controlled housing. I think that allowing demolitions and reconstruction is not really the issue with preserving rent control units. The issue is one of definitions, and that's purely a legislative question. Depending on how the legislation defines demolition and new construction, this concern could be, I think, quite easily addressed without causing these knock-on impacts that distort construction processes. The second impact is preserving affordability and neighborhood character. This, I believe, is mostly a function of the size of buildings, and the size of buildings is a zoning issue. It's not really a demolition construction issue. That can be done with size limits, floor area ratios, as part of the planning code. And that should be done district-wide, so that is not targeting solely buildings that are in need of reconstruction, but it's imposing consistent rules for the entire district. The third interest is historic preservation, and I think we actually have good rules around that already that strongly protect historic resources. Maybe there's some fine-tuning there, but I think that can be accomplished within the historic resource preservation area. And then the fourth interest is fair impact fees being assessed for construction. You currently have a division between alterations versus new construction with higher fees for new construction, and that imposes a burden on people wanting to do significant construction and distorts what they call their projects. This could be rationalized so that, for example, fees are imposed based on square footage expansion rather than just what definition or label you apply to a project. You'd have a lot less opportunity and probably less actual skirting of the rules that way. I think that the rules that you come up with need to be easily enforceable, as you've heard many times, and that means both useful definitions and also useful penalties, so that the penalties are carefully calibrated. It's not so heavy that no one would ever impose that penalty, and it's not so light that no one would ever run afoul of the rules. I suggest that there also be a rule imposed for catastrophic events such as an earthquake, so that we can move quickly to repair, and suggest an interdisciplinary work group.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
All right. Next speaker, please.
Good morning, Commissioners. President Hillis, President McCarthy, Danny Campbell, Sheet Metal Workers Local 104, and Chair of the San Francisco Building Trades Council Public Policy Committee. I spoke to both commissions previously on the issue of bringing factory-built housing into compliance with San Francisco's building codes. This morning, I wanted to just reiterate that the City and County of San Francisco must ensure that any factory-built housing installed in the city complies with the same minimum building standards required for traditional site-built construction, for all the reasons that San Francisco has amended the state's building code in the first place. Despite assertions by proponents of exclusive state regulation who cite the factory-built housing law of 1969, multifamily factory-built housing is subject to local building standards regulation pursuant to the state building standards law of 1979. Proponents' assertions are based on an inaccurate and incomplete analysis of the relevant statutory framework governing building construction in California. In fact, the legislative intent of the factory-built housing law was to regulate single-story residential developments. Moreover, the legislative history leading up to the passage of the law indicates the legislature back in 1969 did not anticipate that factory-built housing would be stacked and used for multi-story development, containing 4 or more dwelling units, as is increasingly being seen here in San Francisco. Testimony before the Assembly Urban Affairs and Housing Committee on April 12, 1969 indicated that the law was intended to apply to single-story housing. Little background, the State Building Standards Law of 1979 vested in the Building Standards Commission the responsibility to approve and publish the building standards related to all occupancies in the state of California, including factory-built housing. Furthermore, the State Building Standards Law vests in local governments the authority to issue building standards to protect public health, safety, and general welfare as they relate to the construction and occupancy of buildings and structures. The State Building Standards Law expressly gives the Building Standards Commission jurisdiction over all buildings except, quote, any mobile home, manufactured home, specially purposed commercial coach, and recreational vehicle, unquote. The legislature defines manufactured homes as built on, quote, a permanent chassis and designed to be used as a single-family dwelling unit or without a foundation when connected to the required utilities. My time is up. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you.
Mr. Landsberg.
Thank you, President Hillis. I want to finish up Mr. Campbell's comments. He actually ended up at a perfect spot. Factory-built housing is conspicuously absent from the list that the legislature put together and is evidence of its intent to place factory-built housing under the authority of the Building Standards Commission. That authority includes adopting and approving standards, amended, added to, or deleted by a city and county or a city and county like us to establish more restrictive building standards, reasonably necessary because of local climatic, geological, or topographical conditions. San Francisco has enacted amendments to the building code for these reasons, and the California Building Standards Commission has accepted them. As one of the building inspectors here said, these are minimum life safety standards, and everyone should be complying with them. In short, the legislature peeled back the reach of the factory-built housing law and put it under the Building Standards Law. In conclusion, the Building Standards Law has provided the Building Standards Commission with the authority to approve and publish the building standards related to all occupancies in the state of California. San Francisco has enacted local amendments to the California Building Standards Code, which have been duly approved by the Commission. Buildings must conform to the code to obtain development approval from the Planning Commission and building permits from the Department of Building Inspection. Factory-built housing law has, again, I want to underscore this, limited preemption under the Health and Safety Code. Although San Francisco is forbidden from banning factory-built housing, which was one of the sort of leftover elements of the factory-built housing law, or from establishing special discriminatory rules for its installation, the city is empowered to apply the same building standards to FBH as other forms of construction and must do so for the health and safety of San Francisco's residents, visitors, workers, and emergency responders. My understanding is that the firefighters, Local 798, has sent in a letter to the mayor supporting this position, and we just spoke with Mr. Keegren of the Residential Builders Association, who also believes that factory-built housing should not gain a competitive advantage by essentially being built substandard to everything else that's going on in this town. So thank you very much. I look forward to this being taken up further on with the Building Inspection Commission, but it's really important that we make this stuff right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please, Ms. Gomez.
Good morning, Commissioners. Cynthia Gomez, Unite Here Local 2. First of all, this is, again, as my colleagues just mentioned, this is under the general public comment. And I also still wanted to echo that the topic which you've mostly been hearing about this morning, which is tantamount to demolition, our members live in the city as well. We have approximately 6,000 members who live in the city. So we're definitely concerned about anything that weakens their accessibility to keep their rent-controlled homes. We're definitely concerned about any changes that would eliminate their ability, that would so weaken them in terms of being demolished, using these rules to sort of work around and end up in an eviction. I also want to note that the timer doesn't seem to be going.
Sorry. We'll dock you a minute.
So what I'll do also is read portions of a letter that we wrote to Mayor Farrell regarding factory-built housing. And in particular, I want to also mention the way that factory-built housing and legislation that affects factory-built housing may also end up applying to and being relevant to other forms of factory-built construction, such as hotels, which is our wheelhouse. So I'll read these portions of this as much as I can. Our union represents approximately 13,000 hospitality workers in San Francisco and San Mateo counties. Local 2 has reviewed a report called Bringing Factory-Built Housing into Compliance with San Francisco Building Code by the San Francisco Building and Construction Trades Council. Local 2 agrees with this analysis, and we urge your office to move quickly to ensure that our members don't have to spend their workplaces in buildings that don't meet minimum local safety standards. One of the many trends that we're observing in hotel development, a pretty prominent trend, is the growth of so-called modular construction, and it's nearly always promoted as a way to cut costs. A full-time hotel worker may end up spending more than 67,000 hours of their life inside their workplace, and so we want to make sure that those hours are spent inside buildings that are safe. Again, not to mention their homes as well. Our understanding of the Council's report is that ultimate inspection authority for factory-built housing, and I assume construction, resides in the state's Department of Housing and Community Development. Nevertheless, we believe that there are steps San Francisco can take to ensure compliance with local building codes and local fire codes. So to that end, we have 4 points we're supporting. 1, require a Department of Building Inspection to contact approved inspection and plan check agencies and inform them of the building and fire code requirements. 2, direct the planning department to advise applicants of the requirement for factory-built housing to comply with the entirety of the San Francisco Building Code. 3, direct Mayor's Office of Housing to inform prospective funding recipients of the necessity of ensuring compliance. 4, direct OCII to inform all prospective funding recipients and development partners of the necessity to ensure compliance with this code. The majority of our members live in this city, and they deserve safe homes and safe workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please, Ms. Gallagher.
Mr. Ionen, can I have the same timer deal? Commissioners, good morning. Thank you so much for convening this important meeting. My name is Mary Gallagher. I've been a planner for 30 years, most of that time in San Francisco. My thinking is that if today you can give us some feedback on just 2 ideas, it would be very helpful to those of us who are working to address problems in the building and planning departments. The first concerns the definition of demolition, because neither the definition, the implementation, or the enforcement of demolition in either code is working anymore. A number of us believe the definition of demolition needs to be rewritten and adopted into both the building and planning code. And specifically, we're looking for a clear, easily understandable definition based on measurable, quantitative standards, and that comes with significant and mandatory penalties for violation. The second concerns the problems of inaccurate plans, which unfortunately is the worst I've seen in 30 years. This includes adjacent homes that are drawn much taller and longer than they really are, grades not being shown accurately, which affects CEQA and height measurements, an omission of neighbors' light wells in side-facing windows. These inaccuracies result in the misapplication of quantitative code standards and qualitative design standards. Now, some planners require extensive adjacent building photographs and check Google Earth to verify plans, but others don't. Some planners make sponsors fix inaccurate plans, but others don't. In a DR not long ago before the Planning Commission, you received testimony from neighbors saying a planner had written, quote, "It's not my job to fix plans," unquote. And indeed, that planner never required them to be fixed, even after extensive proof of inaccuracy had been submitted. And so my question is, well, whose job is it then? A number of us would like to see the following remedies to the problem. Drawings that are signed under penalty of perjury, plan check stops entirely until errors are corrected, there are progressive monetary penalties, and serial violators are publicly identified and reported to licensing agencies. If you want to take that next step of pre-application inspections, I think that would be great. That would shut down this problem for sure. Several speakers, and Ms. Waddy has brought up the issue of goals. Fortunately, the City and County of San Francisco has this document called the General Plan. The goal of this effort is preserving housing affordability, protecting tenants in rental housing, especially rent control housing, and preserving neighborhood character. Tenant protections right now, not just in demolitions, but in all kinds of alterations, it's a significant, perhaps emergency situation, and I'm just not feeling that you're getting that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Jacob Addiardi, Northern California Carpenters Regional Council. Members of the board, members of the commission, thank you for allowing me to speak today. I appreciate your time. If you don't know, we recently organized 2 factory-built housing factories locally here within Northern California to disrupt the industry, which is really taking the traditional methods of construction for the past, I would say, century, and really evolving to what we have today. Building housing in a safe environment more efficiently and cost-effective than traditional construction, all while creating career pathways for individuals to step into the construction trade, knowing they can provide for their families and live where they work. The workers in the factories made a choice, like many Unite Here workers in hotels, to be union. They made the choice through a card check neutrality process and through a collective bargaining unit to be represented by the Carpenters Union. So our plan, working with our partners, is to create more housing, affordable, market rate, and for the homeless in order to meet the local and regional demand, which I might add is these factory-built housing units will be overbuilt, meet the standard, and in addition to that, state approved. It is no secret that the lack of housing that continues to plague us locally and nationally, which will not cease to exist without a solution. Our partners at Factory OS and Rad Urban, taking a holistic approach, have developed a viable solution through unitized housing constructed locally, and I might add locally, not China or Idaho, which it's currently coming from now, to combat this lack. I ask you to look past the attempt by the mechanical, electrical, plumbing trades at this restraint of trade tactics according to labor law, and join our efforts in creating more head of household jobs, more housing, affordable, market rate, and for the homeless. The only constant is change. The only constant is change. Whether we like it or not, it's here. So let's make certain we are on the right side of development to bring solutions. Join us in our efforts. Anything we would view as inhibiting this process is anti-jobs, anti-housing, and anti-homeless. Let's make sure we're on the right side of development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker, please, Mr. Butler.
Good morning, President Hillis, President McCarthy, members of commissions. My name is Joe Butler. I'm an architect here in the city, 30 years in private practice. Existing housing in every neighborhood of our city is the most affordable housing we have left. The planning department uses language in its master plan and general plans that would conserve and protect existing housing and neighborhood character. The building department, not so much. Since this same problem has been ongoing over the 30 years of my architectural practice, broken is apparently how we like our housing policy. Robert Passmore once told me when he was the zoning administrator that slowing the conversion of rental housing stock to ownership housing stock can only be met by enforcement of the planning code. Those days are apparently over. $400 per square foot to buy and build, much borrowed money, yields $1,000 per square foot when sold. That's what's dictating the conversion, not some idle written words. From the days of Joe O'Donoghue and the Cassidys through to the cliffside collapse of Mel Murphy in the Angus McCarthy era, where the Jonathan Pollards and the Rodrigo Santoses are skipping on fees at the planning department and planning scrutiny to hurry their projects along, new private players come up to fill the shoes of those who have already retired from this wealthy game. Fraudulent plans, however, are only the tip of an iceberg that one can see. The favoritism process, once quiet and insular, is now widespread and epidemic. Throughout the decades, only one thing in all of these formulas remained the same, and that's DBI senior management, under which all of this has flourished. When we lose an 1861 house on Russian Hill to vandals, and then a 1907 Willis Polk residence to greed, one could say it's a run of bad luck. But with the same folks in charge of the complaints and the inspections, and with the ultimate discretion that comes with it, stuff just continues. Friends of Ed Sweeney can get any permit, anytime, for anything. They can have trashed, squashed, or gutted any neighborhood complaint that they don't like, and have hidden from planning all manner of violations that would be apparent if the two departments cooperated. The lost fees from hiding scope of work cost the city money. The collapsing buildings cost the public its safety. The lack of inspections undermine the confidence that should exist with multi-million-dollar properties. The uneven playing field encourages others to cheat, and the result is a city out of control with illegal work and demolitions and $600 per square foot profits on every rule that can be broken. You should change the codes to agree on demolition, but you may need to clean house in the departments before any enforcement comes from it.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker, Mr. Welch. And if there's others who would like to speak, please line up on the screen side of the room. Welcome.
Calvin Welch. Thank you very much for a critically needed hearing, as you've heard. I would associate my remarks with Mr. Weber's and Ms. Gallagher's and expand them to say that we're now on the verge of a fundamental and basic change in state policy, which will render demolitions even more significant. And as the last speaker reflected, rather eloquently, I thought, make it even more profitable to demolish existing buildings. And that is the state mandated, and unfortunately the city kind of going along with a local version of density bonuses. Once you start placing extraordinary densities allowed by state law that sets aside all zoning and design, local zoning and design requirements, I hear the cash registers already going ka-ching. And the way in which between the ka and the jing that has to happen is demolition. So it is critically important that we take a look, close every loophole, dot every I, cross every T in our local demolition ordinances if we are to avoid the massive displacement of existing residents in San Francisco. Ms. Gallagher is absolutely right. The policy is clear. It's clear in the housing element of the general plan. It is to preserve affordable housing and not to allow demolition of sound housing except to enhance affordability. The voters made it clear many years ago in Section 101.1 of the Planning Code. The preservation, it is generally assumed in the housing element that the most affordable housing stock in San Francisco is the existing housing stock. It won't be existing if it's demolished. So we have a critical, important role to play in preserving our communities and neighborhoods in San Francisco by understanding the enhanced critical role of demolitions and demolition controls. It's not enough to only solve the problems of the past. We have to look at the challenges of the future that we are facing. We may be able to stop 827 this legislative session. The pressure is going to continue to be applied to gut local land use laws. The only way that we can avoid the worst possible outcome of that policy is by stringent demolition controls. This city is 99.9% developed.
Thank you, Mr.
New
Welch.
development can only happen with demolition.
Next speaker, please.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming, and Building and Planning Department. My name is Kieran Buckley. I'm a builder here in San Francisco for some time now. Basically in agreement with a lot of what was said here today. It's 317 is very confusing. As a builder, doing these projects, I've done several of these projects where it just always, just to be straight, we want to do the right thing. You want to keep everything that's significant, but I often wonder why we're keeping, we'll say, blind walls that are built 100 years ago that no one will ever see and not up to code. I understand when there's a part of the building that's significant to the neighborhood that you keep. I think that's very important. We've got to keep that. But when you're keeping walls like that, or joists that you never see or nobody ever sees, and they're not up to code. So you're trying to get that up to code and tie it into the new stuff, which in turn drives up the costs. And then when the cost goes up, it's the end result is it's an expensive building to build. And I guess to do it, it's very difficult because you're lifting. I don't know if any of you have gone out and saw how the process works, but you lift up a building slightly to take the weight off, because you've got to put in a new foundation, and all these buildings they're pretty old. You put in a new foundation. The walls are hanging there, and this is a wall that nobody will ever see in between two buildings. It's not up to code. It's dangerous. It's dangerous working in these conditions. You're always concerned about life safety. Then you've got the waterproofing aspect of that, which is another problem. Let me see what else. I guess, that's about all I've got to say, I think, as a builder. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Butler.
Thank you. Bye.
Next speaker, please.
William Pashalinski. I'm an architect. I've done numerous smaller projects in town, predominantly residential, predominantly what we're talking about. Maybe I'm one of the few people that actually understands 317 in town. It is almost like rocket science sometimes. But I still think it's trying to solve a problem that has to do with affordable housing, that it's being used in lieu of using the codes. Instead, I know I was from the Planning Commission on several projects several months ago. I no longer will take on a substantial single-family house anymore. I've let all my clients know, both for practical reasons and because I am a 42-year resident of the city, lived in the Haight-Ashby in a very nice Victorian for 40 years. But I think that a lot of the answer to this is higher density. So in my little area of the world, I do feel it's important to get higher density buildings. And if you do want the larger house, that as part and parcel of that, almost like a BMR, that you really should be doing an ADU or adding a rental unit as part and parcel of the project. I think that would be a whole lot better way to go to get higher density housing in lieu of trying to do these requirements for demolition that other people have talked about. Contrary to many of the things we've heard, I know there's a lot of anger out there. There were projects talked about. I think there was one I actually interviewed for with a developer. It was a Neutral building. I got in my car as fast as I can go and got out of there. There are bad developers, and their hands should be more than slapped. It was a great building, and I was really sorry to hear it go. There was another of my buildings mentioned this morning, though. I won't give you the address, but it's in a historic district. We were restoring a Victorian. It had been stuccoized in the 20s. All the houses around it were Victorians. We presented to planning pictures as much as we could to document what had been there originally. Project was approved during the construction. We took off the stucco. There were scar lines. We requested that it was Richard Sucre of the Historic Preservation Department come out, worked with us to even get a closer representation. The project's almost done. I defy anybody to go out there and tell the difference of that building to any of its neighbors. So we do try and work hard to submit plans and then keep them as close as possible to what's been approved. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Just want to say thank you to Liz Waddy and the Planning Department and Pat O'Riordan with the Building Department for the presentation and the opportunity to have an open conversation with the whole community. I work in the construction industry, and we agree with a lot of what we've heard today. The current code isn't working for a lot of people. And I encourage something that is new and consistent between both departments and transparent and understandable for everybody involved, which is the contractor, the neighbors, the community, the inspectors, and everybody. Speaking very practically, life safety is something that I consider very important, and structural soundness is also a big priority. I think the code should address unpredictability of things that come up in the field and unexpected site conditions. It should include allowances for these issues to be addressed in the field honestly, in an efficient and practical way, for the sake of the end user, the neighbors, and the community, and the safety of the site workers. I also support a strong code of ethics for all developers, and these professionals who aren't complying, for there to be penalties set up, because clearly they're giving a bad name to those of us who do respect the process. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keegren.
Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, staff, for your presentation. I'd like to start off by saying I do agree with most of what was said here today. We have a problem when people can't understand this very complex system called 317. It is extremely confusing. We need to coordinate and have one single definition of demolition. That is such a common sense request. We need a modern penalty system. It's not just one system. There's many different variations of this penalty system that we need. We need a professional code of ethics. And why do we need these things? We need them because we're seeing fractures in our trust. And the minute we see a fracture in that trust, we have a big problem. Because our system of approving housing is not that great. It's clumsy, it's awkward, and it's anything but nimble and quick. And to make it work in any way, it takes trust. And if we lose that, we're all in trouble. My second and final point is, we need a system of rules and policies that aligns our efforts and our energy with our values. If I took you out and I showed you a blind wall condition, and if I asked you, is there a 1-month-old stud in that wall, a 100-year-old stud in that wall, or a metal stud in that wall, nobody would tell the difference. So how does that add value? So what if it came down? However, those walls that don't add value, maybe they have a set of priorities and a set of policies that's a little bit different. There are walls that do add value. We need to clearly identify those walls, get them approved by planning, color code them on the set of plans, and have a different set of standards for those walls where value is added. Have pre-inspections on those walls. Have a different penalty system for those walls. And any changes to those walls gets routed back to planning. The industry, more than anybody, and I know it's staff at DBI, and I know it's staff at planning, and I know it's the community, but I feel more than anybody, we need a clear set of rules which puts the emphasis and efforts of our staff, of the industry, of the community in line with our general and broader goals and policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please. And if there's anybody else who'd like to speak, please line up on the screen side of the room. Just pull that mic down. We can hear you better. Ma'am, will you pull that mic down so we can hear you? Thanks.
I want to thank you all for having this meeting. I want to be as short as possible. I think the consensus today has been that there needs to be a qualitative rather than discretionary definition of the word demolition, and it needs to be consistent for both departments. The reason that it needs to be consistent and the reason that this demolition issue is so very important is because, as Joe Butler and others have said, the preservation of existing housing is the preservation of the most affordable housing in San Francisco. Fortunately or unfortunately, if you're going to demolish a piece of property and build another building, the cost of that building, either to buy or to rent, is going to increase dramatically. Assuming that we can obtain a qualitative definition, my next point is that the definition needs to be enforced, just like all the laws and rules regarding planning and building inspections need to be enforced. As I walk around the neighborhood and I walk around the city almost every day, a lot. I can see that there are various projects in various states of construction that do not appear to be consistent with what is on the building permit. If I can see that, others can see that. And unfortunately, when city agencies fail to enforce their own laws, it leads to a disrespect for the law, for those laws and all the laws in the city. And as we all live in increasingly close quarters, we need to engender respect for all of our laws, not to discourage it. Finally, I have a suggestion which may seem overly simplistic, and that is once there's an outstanding permit, an outstanding building permit, that some official with some authority be dispatched to review the site of that permit with some regularity. It appears that these permits are issued and no one from the building department even visits these sites until the building is finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional public comment on this item? Great. Seeing none, we will close public comment. Thank you all very much for this ongoing conversation. I know we don't all have kind of mics and monitors, but maybe Commissioner McCarthy, President McCarthy, if we want to kind of just go around first with the building commission and take an initial shot at questions and comments, and then we'll do the planning commission, and then if there's follow-up beyond that, we can do that.
Yeah.
Commissioner Constant, do you want to start if you have any questions or comments?
Great. I was wondering why has there ever been a thought of having an inspection to verify the as-built when plans are presented?
Do we want to, if staff wants to respond, that may be helpful.
Yes, that has probably been discussed in the past. I wasn't part of the discussion. But as was mentioned by a couple of the speakers here, when a design professional submits documents to both DBI and planning, they're state licensed, and there probably should be, in my opinion, probably should be conversation about penalty to be truthful, perjury. So, I mean, that's a good conversation to be had. But yes, I mean, we are willing to entertain any suggestions and make changes as needed to make it better so that we catch these things as early in the game as we can. Start of work or pre-issuance inspections, they're all better ways of making sure that we don't have to deal with the things we deal with from time to time presently.
Thank you.
And not knowing all my commissioners might want to speak on this, but Commissioner Gilman, do you want to speak then on this? Yeah.
On the specific
yes,
issue?
Yeah.
No, if you want to talk about as-built, I can come back for my comments.
No, I'm trying to take it in
yes.
order. If you want to, then Commissioner Warsaw, and then.
Okay. Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Actually, I wanted to sort of just start with more comments. First, I wanted to thank both planning staff and DBI staff for this presentation. And then I really want to thank the community and the public and everyone who came out here today. I'm really touched by the comments that were made, and so these are broader comments. They're not so much technical questions. I would definitely like us to see, moving forward, either a joint working group between the two departments so that we can really take up, A, many of the suggestions that were made by the public, and B, get to a point where whether it's a common definition or two definitions, we have more clarity. I think some of the most important things that the community brought up that I'd like to see explored by both the departments, besides the as-built, are also advanced inspections of sites to verify that what's being brought across the counter is accurate and correct. I think in particular, too, as we're seeing more demolition used to create larger units or displace rent-controlled tenants, I'd like us to look at a couple of things on that area. One is requesting rental information going back 5 years to see what the tenancy records are, particularly when it comes to rent-controlled units. I'd like us to see looking at policies and procedures similar to what the affordable housing community has around what's called resident briefings and notifications at different stages of development, When we do acquisition rehabilitation of large projects, we're mandated to have monthly resident briefings where we're bringing up what's happening with construction, what's going on. While I don't want to make this burdensome to small property owners, I think we should look at a threshold of X number of units would require these briefings, whether tenants are on-site or off-site. And I'd also like us to take into account the fact that this tool is being used for displacement and for illegal conversions. And I know it's the second agenda item we have, but I think we need to seriously look at our fines and our enforcement authority. I concur that lately, particularly with the boom in the real estate market over the last 15 years, we're being asked way more to ask for forgiveness, not permission. And I think both these bodies have an obligation to have developers asking us for permission. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Warsaw, please.
Many of my comments are similar to Commissioner Gilman's, starting with thanking staff and the speakers for providing all this educated and worthwhile commentary. Several of the points are also ones that Commissioner Gilman just mentioned. We obviously need simple, clear, and common definition of what a demolition is, and there is clearly a need for a task force to immediately commence to begin work on making this happen as quickly as possible. Some of the other points she made, pre-permit applications to ensure that we not have surprises, that we're following these things carefully and well, are clearly needed. Tenant protections, the recommendation providing 5 to 10 years of records, especially where rent control is involved, seem to be quite reasonable and in character with city goals. In addition to those that she mentioned, one thing that I'd like to bring up is several speakers mentioned it's been 3.5 years since we've had a joint session. And I certainly think that this has been a very productive day, and I think that we should be looking at calendaring regular joint sessions, whether they be quarterly or semi-annual. This is how we should be working together to be sure we're presenting consistent and clear policy to facilitate good building standards to improve our housing stock and move projects forward as expeditiously as possible with minimal confusion. One of the other things that's very high in my mind, the issue of serial bad actors. I think we have to, at this point, accept that we have some serial bad actors and our penalties currently are not an adequate deterrent to them. And we need to immediately begin to look at improving real penalties, and if we need that to be through the legislative path, to work with the Land Use Committee of the Board of Supervisors to really have some significant penalties for serial bad actors. It's the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I think we've been fooled more than twice by some people, and there have to be serious penalties. How we develop what those are, whether they include licensing, whether they require more perjury or misrepresentation penalties remains to be seen, but that needs to be addressed. A last issue that was brought up by some people was the historic protections. Obviously, historic buildings are a very key piece of our city character, and they are some of our most vulnerable buildings. And developing protocols in particular for our historic assets is one of the most important things that we can do jointly between DBI Planning and, where appropriate, HPC. Thank you.
Commissioner Lee, please.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to this meeting. I like a lot of what I heard today from the public, and I agree with many of the things they said, and what our commission is thinking about too. I do agree that we should have a simple or single definition of what demolition should be, so that both departments can understand and know exactly what those criteria are, and as well as the public and the project sponsors. I mean, they all need to know what definition of demolition should be and what triggers it. I also like the idea of our department going out to do a pre-site or a site visit prior to issuing a permit or allowing a builder to start construction. Maybe these should be limited to projects that has a 311 notice, maybe, something like that. I think that's a great idea. I also like what our department's engineer told us about how certain code items are triggered and may eventually lead to what we currently call a demolition. I mean, I think those are very important factors. We need to decide whether we should incorporate those type of code upgrades into a definition of a demolition or not. I think the public may misunderstand a few things, and I'd like to explain this. I think a lot of our project sponsors, architects, engineers, contractors already know this, but correct me if I'm wrong, but when project sponsors want to alter a building or build something on top of it, or a horizontal addition, vertical addition, they submit plans to the planning department. And those plans are very simple. Those plans just show, this is what I want to do. I want to add a room here, I want to add a floor here. But that's it. Then the project sponsor, I think, sits back and wait until the planning commission rules on whether or not this is appropriate and go ahead and do it. After that approval is done, then the negotiation or not, actually the review goes to the building department. And that's when the project sponsors start learning what code requirements are triggered, right? Which walls need to be thickened, which walls need to be taken down and applied back on with weatherproofing or whatever, which column need to be strengthened. These things are then decided before the permit is issued. But guess what? This isn't broadcasted to the neighborhood, right? The neighborhood doesn't know that. They only saw the first 311 notice that said, hey, we're just adding this. But now they don't know about the code requirement that triggered, hey, this wall needs to be removed and strengthened. You know, something has to be done to let the public know about those changes. That's all.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Commissioner Walker, I believe, yeah.
Thank you, staff. Thank you, commissioners, and thank you all for coming. And many of us have been in this conversation for well over 20 years. I want to join in the recommendations of Commissioner Gilman and Warshall, and especially around, there's three sort of elements, the definition, focusing on the definition, implementation, and enforcement. I think that there are relevant actions to be taken and conversations to have in each. The addition of site visits when we are reviewing plans is really an important step. It ties into the second calendar issue that we have about when you have false plans. It also ties into serial offenders. That's the enforcement part too. But we need to make sure that they're accurate plans and that they're actually what is being reviewed by planning when they're talking about it. But it's this, one of the things that comes up for me in this whole conversation is you go in when you intend to do a demolition, you have a certain process that you use. What we're talking about is those projects that end up being demolitions in the field. A lot happens behind those 8-foot walls that somebody was mentioning before. And I want to just put out there that it's really not about whatever your intention is around demolition. The fact is a demolition is a demolition if it fits the definition of demolition by the quantitative measurement. So someone who has to tear down a wall because it's got dry rot, or add a wall because they need support for the addition that was approved by planning, in the field they determined that they have to structure it so that it effectively now fits into the definition of demolition. You know, it's still a demolition. So at some point we need to really focus on noticing the neighbors, making this information transparent, making sure our staff knows when to reroute it back to planning to review it as a demolition. And you know, it's a whole process that we're counting on the public to tell us about. And this idea of doing regular visits on these projects is probably the best way around this, is to really get people out, especially on projects where we know that there's going to be additional weight that's going to affect the walls, and where we actually can anticipate certain things happening. We should be scheduling regular visits on site to have somebody really review what's going on. And I know our inspectors do, but it's not the intention that's important here of whether they're intending to demolish or not. It's the fact of what happens. And so my issue, of course, is because when something is demolished, all of a sudden you're losing rent control. So the issue of how we use our new permit tracking system to flag this information, to include information about, when flagging us when certain things happen, if certain permits are issued on site, that we actually flag to notice neighbors. This idea that I liked from Commissioner Gilman about actually scheduling regular meetings with folks involved to preempt issues that might come up. It's a good idea. I mean, it's something that we should, I don't know that we require it, but it's certainly something that needs to happen. So the 5-year history of tenancy is really important. This should be required at the initial stage of permit application. It's something that the planning department should look at. And this information, the issues that we have around code enforcement and making sure the public knows all of what we're doing when this stuff happens. So the Acela system that we have, I know planning already has it, but there's all sorts of opportunities to make information available to the public through that system. And I hope that we take full advantage of that, working with what has been suggested of a task force between our departments, but also maybe some representative members of the public to, tell us what, their issues are and their ideas are, and make it available. Because, again, the trust issue is because this happens behind walls, literal and figurative. If we have a process that is more inclusive and that people can really find out real information about, it's going to help with our trust issue. So again, thank you all for being here, and I hope that we can do this regularly. It shouldn't take us 3 years to schedule meetings. We like doing this, and it's really helpful. It helps our staff and it helps the public trust. So let's try to do this on a regular basis.
If it's okay with President Hillis there, I would like to hear from the planning commissioners before I close out my final comments.
Sure.
Thank you.
Commissioner Moore, do you want to start? Okay. Hey, Commissioner Fong.
Sure, I'll start. It's pretty difficult. I think we are all in agreement, and to follow up and say anything absolutely new, and in agreement with the public and with staff. And I think there's an absolute need for modification. I think it's a challenge. I think we should not necessarily blame ourselves. The city has grown a tremendous amount. Valuations of real estate have gone up tremendously. To the point which we'll talk more about penalties. I don't think the penalties have necessarily increased to the values of these projects. So, hey, $4,000, no problem. It's a $4 million project, no big deal. So we should make sure that that's adjusted. Stepping back a little bit, I think it's important that that we set up a task force, a group with maybe some community members involved, some of us involved. Get that next date scheduled. I have great confidence in both staffs of both departments to be able to come up with some fresh ideas and fold in some of the ideas that the public also brings in. One question I've always kind of been concerned about, and this is citywide and even beyond these two departments, is the enforcement teams in which the city, we sort of respond to problems by phone calls or complaints driven by the public. And I don't know if it was going back in time, maybe years when the budget was greater, that we had an enforcement team out there to make random checks, have a greater presence on the job sites. And so I'm curious if that has been discussed. I know that's more money, but again, we're talking bigger stakes here and maybe worth bringing that back. Permit tracking system, I believe that we have not seen the full potential of that. Looking forward to seeing that. Looking forward to seeing that as a tool, both for the public, but both for staff and the departments. And really, just this is, I think we're in a time and age in this city, in this nation, where we need to catch up on some things. Technology is speeding up. The cost of living is speeding up. Doing business is faster. Probably back in the old days, if you had a question back to the architect, it would take a week to come back. The fact that someone can text message and get that information is faster, and so the expectation of turning things around and efficiency is greater exponentially now. And so I kind of point this back. I know this is not the topic, but when we're dealing with things with scooters on the streets and Airbnb and such, and I think this is a time where people are pushing very hard and for good reason. And so now it's time for public policy to catch up to that and frankly get ahead of that curve and try to, again, be a little bit of futurist and get ahead of that. So those are my comments for now.
Thanks. Commissioner Melgar.
Thank you. Commissioner Fong, I think this is one of a case where we're not blaming ourselves. I think we're blaming each other. So having sat on both commissions, I think, I've listened to the discussion on both commissions, not surprisingly, well, it's, the planning department or it's the building inspection department. And I think, in this case, there's clearly an area of growth in terms of both process and legislation, I think. It seems clear to me that our current planning definition actually encourages folks sort of hedging their bets so that they will come in with lower costs and also not have to come in front of the commission for a CU. And I've seen people do that, just play that. And it's actually an encouragement to the situation that we have a powerful economic incentive to play this game. And I think, on the building code side, there is the just public perception that inspectors will interpret the code in a different way. Whether or not it's happening, the vagueness of the code, invites that, and it's not a good thing for the department or the public. So I think, I do with all due respect to Ms. Shudish, who I, respect so much, I do think that there should be one definition in a very clear, transparent definition that's understandable and easy to calculate, and it should be quantifiable as much as possible. And, we do have the technology to work together. I'm not sure that we're using it. I will just point out, to Spike's comment that in Oakland, building inspection and planning and neighborhood preservation are all in one department. Now, we're not going to do that here, most likely, but we do have the technology to have a more seamless process. So I think, it's a complicated problem, as Ms. Waddy presented. So I don't think there's going to be one fix. I think it's both legislation and process. And I think that, working with our legislative partners, Supervisor Peskin is already on this and has been for quite some time. I think that we need to make sure that staff in the departments are both involved in that process, because sometimes, between, policy and procedure, a lot gets lost along the way. So we have to make sure that, both the legislation hits what we intend in terms of, the preservation of sound structures, affordability, neighborhood character, but also that the process, it works and that it's transparent and it doesn't have unintended economic consequences, because clearly it does. And I think the staff in both departments have enough experience to be able to foresee, if you do this, that's going to happen, because we've seen it. And then lastly, I would say that this talk about, recurrent bad actors, is something that's been going on for years, to Commissioner Warshall's point. And I think, perhaps, and we'll talk about fees and fines next, but I think that maybe we can start in this new seamlessly technical collaboration in Nacella by requiring folks who are those bad actors, we already know who they are, we already have a list, we've seen them over and over, to have that initial inspection. And, it's an idea that has been brought up. I'm not really sure how it'll work out in practice, because you'll have to open up a wall to make sure, to see whether the, 2x4s are rotten. So at what point would that happen? Do we issue like a temporary permit, until the inspection happens? And I think that staff really needs to think through the process, not just the legislation and the policy. Those are my comments. I look forward to being involved with this and to supporting staff, because I do believe that you guys want to get this fixed. You're up to here hearing complaints about it. And it is an issue of preserving our neighborhoods and the fabric of our city. Thank you.
Thanks. Commissioner Richards?
So I've been waiting 4 years for this meeting, so I'm going to take up some time, to be honest with you. Hopefully we won't wait 4 more years. So the word that kept coming up over and over and over again on that side of the rail, on this side of the rail, is trust. 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 Mr. Keegren said trust is being fractured. I think we've lost the trust of the public. I really do. We're not fractured. We've lost the trust. We're affecting people's lives by what we do up here. We had a neighbor who has a foundation issue as a result of an illegal demo on Alvarado Street. We have people that are getting evicted. We're affecting people's lives and the people that actually build the buildings. I mean, we're affecting everybody's lives. So our inaction is actually enabling this situation to continue. If you keep allowing graffiti to be painted on your building, more graffiti shows up. If you keep allowing people to jump turnstiles at BART and Muni, more people are going to jump turnstiles at BART and Muni. It's time to actually deal with the problem, and we have a big problem. Part of the lack of trust, and I hear this all the time from people in my neighborhood, in the Castro, in Noe Valley, is there are 2 sets of rules. There are rules for the connected, and then there are rules for the rest of us. And I hear all kinds of horror stories, and I've lived some myself, around a 1/4 of an inch here or something there, where everything has to be redone. But then you see very egregious things happening to buildings where they build beyond what the stated permit shows. We've seen outright fraud, 214 States, 655 Alvarado. We've had one on Funston. Not only was it that the building wasn't, the site conditions weren't verified, the building that was built in its place wasn't according to plans. I mean, that's absurd, right? I want to follow that one, because we actually had the building cut back. I don't know if they ever cut the building back or not, but that was our ruling on the DR. I also think, and one question that I keep asking is, how do these people that keep doing this stuff keep getting permits? I mean, God, there needs to be a flag somewhere that says, hey, somebody who, I forget what the schmuck's back. We need to actually have a higher level of scrutiny for the schmuck factor here. I believe criminal acts deserve criminal penalties. And I believe what we're seeing here are criminal acts. They may not be criminal by some statute, but what they're doing to people and what they're doing to the process and what they're doing to people's view of us are criminal. And I'm sitting up here and I'm actually feeling like we're being compared to the EPA from the public. We're in charge of the rules, yet we interpret them and we break them when we want. And poof, no problem. And that's what, it pains me to sit here and hear all this stuff. Two, I heard, thank you staff, Ms. Waddy, Mr. O'Riordan, coming from tech for 30 years into the city was shocking. Why is it shocking? In tech, we were, I hate this term, looking at breaking things and making things radically different. When I hear some of the solutions here today, I take pause because I keep hearing our solution is going to be based on the existing conditions of the organization. We don't have people that have any expertise in structural engineering or whatever, so we're not going to go get it. We're not going to change anything. Our enforcement's based on public complaints. Why? What's that getting us? Oh, our enforcement's based, and we're going to be talking about this, it's based on getting them into compliance. Well, what's the effect of that been? It's only encouraged it happening more and more. So I think a fundamental look back and questioning everything we do, from organization structure, like in Oakland, all the way down, needs to be looked at. Everything should be on the table. I think everything that we do needs to be have a basis in reality and stop being constrained by what we think we can and can't do. I was sitting in a supervisor's office this week and we were talking about evictions, and I kept hearing, but the rent board won't do that, but the rent board won't. And I said, either you get them to do it or you replace them. I mean, we have a public policy objective that we need to achieve. We're not there to coddle the rent board. We're there to actually get something done. And that's what I think my message here is. What is the policy objective around all this? I mean, very good question I think staff asked. I was in a meeting this week, and we talked about this, and they said, everything's unaffordable, so what's the point of saving anything? And I thought, that's kind of right. Not many people can afford much. So I actually looked on the California Association of Realtors website, and they actually have a graph since 1991 to first quarter of 2017. What's the affordability rate of your median-priced house in San Francisco? And I have it here, but you can pull it up if you'd want. It's called the San Francisco Housing Affordability Index since 1991. So the highest it's been, and that was in first quarter of 2012, was nearly 30%. So for people to say, and it goes over time based on economic cycle. So we have highs of 30%, and right now we're at about 12. So do we want to just say we're going to freeze the unaffordability rate at 12% because that's what it is now, but it was 30% not only a few years ago, and it was 30% as well in the past? We need to look at whether existing housing affordability, preserving it's actually getting us what we want. So 17 Temple, it's a shack. It needed waterproofing. It needed all kinds of stuff. I had a project around the corner. I used to walk by 17 Temple because we had it as a DR. It was indefinite continued forever. So I was paying attention to this 17 Temple. Needed a lot of work. Now, the question is, what do you do with the 17 Temples where we see all the building code issues that are there? Needs to be weatherproofed and fireproofed and A, B, C, D, E. So that needs to be considered in all this, and that needs to be considered in the affordability as well. But we need to understand what we're really trying to do here with definition of demo if we're trying to prevent things from being supersized and magnified in terms of the value back to the person who's doing the work. So Mr. Welch raised a very, very interesting point. With all the discussion around SB 827, Housing Accountability Act, and rent control, we need to get a handle on what the definition of demolition really is. Because if clearly there's a carve-out for local demolition control should these state mandates pass, it's essential for us to have a definition. I don't know now what is rent control or not based on definition of demolition. I don't. Is it taking the foundation away? Is it getting a new CFC? Is it so much percent, so many hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of work? Nobody will tell me. And I think we need to decide that in our work group because this is a real issue and it's causing displacement. I also think that from a process point of view, two things we need to look at. How the definition of demolition interplays with different state laws. So if we finally figure out that SB 827 or son of SB 827 or whatever's going to come our way, there will probably be a son of 827, let's face it. If it really has carve out for demolitions, but you put the Housing Accountability Act on top of it, what does that do to our definition of demolition? I mean, seriously, we've got 2 projects right now that are being continued, one coming up in May at 792 Cap, where we have a demolition of a single-family house, yet the replacement of the replacement project's bringing more units in than the 1 unit in the single-family house. We have one at 137 Clayton as well. So we need to understand the interplay between this. I'm suspicious that it's an end run around, even further end run around local control. I also think that if we're going to go down this route, we should separate demolition from the replacement project. So if truly there is an issue with Housing Accountability Act, we should look at first, do we want to demo the building? Yes or no? And then we look at the project behind it. I think that's key. Tenant considerations, number 5. Renovictions are happening. I mean, they're happening a lot. And it's whether we had one out on, I believe it was 9th Avenue, where the developer pulled in some type of machinery, and it was running on gas or kerosene, and he ran it all day long, and he smoked the tenants out of their units. They couldn't stand it anymore. That's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. You know, the incentive to get rid of tenants is so high that people are doing all kinds of nasty things. And I'm not saying it's the majority of people. It's certainly the minority of people, but it's really creating a lot of issues. The other thing when I hear about we don't have the budget, we don't have the people, you have to remember we have to look at this holistically. So if what we're doing allows displacement or allows homelessness, somewhere else down the line, somebody's going to pay for it. So why don't we just try to prevent it up front? So I think these are the things we need to look at. Lastly, I think the guiding principles around what we're dealing with, and that's what everybody else said here, I completely agree. Clear, comprehensible definition across both planning and buildings needed. We need to encourage maximum unit density. So if you're going to demolish a building, we need to figure out whether you can actually add units or not. And we may be able to have to change the law for that. We need to deal with fraudulent plans and bad actors quickly and effectively so that people don't think this is the way we operate. Whatever we do, it needs to be comprehensible. I mean, I sat here and listened to the definition of 317, and I heard Mr. O'Riordan's definition. It's not comprehensible, probably to hardly anybody outside of the organizations that manage it. So clear definition of demolition, alteration, expansion. Implementation is key. We need to make sure that we minimize fraud and appeals. So I think the give me to some of the people in the development community will be, it's going to be clear-cut, understandable, and you're not going to get DR'd, automatic DR and everything, which happens today because people don't trust the system. Enforcement needs to be a deterrent. We're going to talk about that. And I think the other point I walked away with was whatever we do with demolition, alteration, expansion needs to include how you bring the building up to code to the best that you can. We need to reverse engineer anything we do. We need to hack the hell out of it and think like one of these schmucks to see where the loophole is and how I can drive my truck through it. So, and I look forward to this working group, and I look forward to some big things coming about because I think there's the will here finally to do something.
Thanks. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you. I just want to echo all of my colleagues' thanks to members of the public for coming out, for your thoughtful testimony, and for looking to be true partners with us in addressing this issue and challenge. I will say that this is an incredibly complicated issue, but the good news is that we are all aligned. What I've heard again and again from planning staff, from DBI, from my fellow commissioners, from builders, from community members is we need better tools to address this issue, and we want to work together to address them. I think we absolutely need a good, clear definition of demolitions that helps to direct guide folks in the community and folks that are in the field inspecting these buildings, one that is accessible, and so that folks, again, from builders to our departments are all on the same page. We need to be proactive, and many fellow commissioners have mentioned the fact that we have technology to be proactive, to flag projects that are likely going to be problematic, and that help us all work together to protect our end goal, which is affordable housing. I've heard again and again, not only on this issue, but on other issues, that we need to be better about protecting our affordable housing and being proactive about it. So again, understanding what the uses of these buildings were before is incredibly important, and making sure that we're cataloging our rental housing stock is important. And then finally, really, again, being able to hold bad actors accountable. We all know who they are, and we need a process to be able to do that. This issue actually came up in another city that I used to work in called in Boston, where we had these same types of issues. And what it actually took was an interagency working group coming together, not just folks, commissioners or elected officials, but folks that are actually in the field on the ground coming together weekly and monthly to bring up projects that either are blatantly against the rules or are exhibiting possibilities of actually going against the rules, and making sure that we're all on the same page constantly. And so I look forward to working with my fellow commissioners and members of planning staff and DBI to address this issue.
Thank you. Commissioner Koppel.
Yeah, thanks again to both presidents, both commissions, both department staffs, and the public for their very important opinions today. This is a very extremely important topic. I look back at my past in the field. I've built hospitals, I've built commercial buildings, I've built residential buildings, I've pulled permits, I've passed my inspections, and I've passed my fire marshal finals. I do think that Calvin Welch made a very important comment when he said that we're going to keep dealing with all of these topics. This is a small city. We don't have a lot of unbuilt land. Whenever we do develop something, there's probably going to be a demolition involved. Both my parents live here in the city in separate rent-controlled apartments. So rent control, evictions, demos, fires, homelessness, displacement, development, building codes, and more importantly, life safety is what it's all about. If you guys don't trust us, if you guys don't feel safe, that's not okay. Dovetailing off the trust and the safety, I want to stay on topic today. I'm not going to talk about jobs. I'm not going to talk about politics. I'm going to talk about safety. In the effort to produce safe housing and protect persons and property from fire or danger, our San Francisco building, electric, plumbing, fire, and seismic codes are the strictest in the world for a reason, and they are the bare minimum to which we should be constructing our buildings. Construction shortcuts and substandard building methods should never be our solution to producing more housing. Life safety is at stake. I'm very concerned that the public may not fully understand some of these issues. To clarify the importance of this topic, we must remind ourselves that this issue deals with dwelling units where tenants will be sleeping and thus they may not be aware of a potential fire until it's too late. I wanted to look at a couple specific examples instead of just talking generally about this. I do understand there's two prefabricated modular housing developments here in the city, one at 38 Harriet Street and one at 5830 3rd Street. And I question whether these buildings were built to the local San Francisco building code. Did electrical, plumbing, fire sign off for the rough end of these build-outs? If not, as it relates to disclosure and transparency, were the tenants made aware of this noncompliance? As it relates to understanding what the implications are of remodels, were the tenants made aware that if they open up walls or ceilings, that they, at their dime, are responsible for bringing the units up to the local building code? If they were, great, but I'm just asking the question because they may not have been. Were the neighboring buildings made aware of these non-compliant buildings? We've heard here before that existing buildings are impacted by the demo of neighboring buildings. And again, when life safety is at stake, I'm not going to be able to stand behind non-compliant buildings. Also, was the fire department or the firefighters, Local 798, made aware of these non-compliance buildings? They are very, very concerned with the safety of our residents and the safety of themselves. And they need to know what they're getting into when they go to a building that's potentially on fire with residents in it. At some point, I'd like an informational presentation from DBI staff regarding these concerns. I think it's in the best interest of the residents of this city to know when and where buildings are not being built to the San Francisco local building code. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Moore.
I want to thank the public. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for a most concise and inspirational exchange of ideas and thoughts. I appreciate that the public, who has all reasons and is in front of us week in, week out, is not showing anger, but is basically asking us to take the responsibility of why we're sitting in this place, in this particular seat for the first reason. There is consensus on developing a single, more stringent demolition definition. This is a first because the history of two different definitions has been around for an extremely long time, and while there were very valiant efforts in the last 2 or 3 decades to come up with additional controls, such as the 317, in the end, while we in the beginning believed it was an effective tool, ultimately the devil's in the details. And unfortunately, the devil went into the details, and we somehow lost control and oversight. We're also having people, unfortunately, who knew how to play the system and basically outsmarted all of those who followed the rules, yet others knew how to prevent them. And I think that is one of the most painful realizations when you sit here today and hear the call that we as 2 commissions and as 2 departments need to come together to really stop that practice. And then going down the list of important elements which lay the foundation for a change practices, and I'm not necessarily quoting them in the order of importance. Perhaps the most important one are tenant considerations and protection of rent-controlled housing, particularly because older buildings are the target of where these practices by bad actors have been practiced. It is to start also with something which is difficult given the nature and the age of our buildings. I picked up on your comment, verify as built, for example, a very complicated subject matter. I'm going through a seismic retrofit, and to produce as built, even for a building was only built in 1950, is a heroic act of trying to find a needle in the haystack. And I am not criticizing DBI that the records aren't there, but those are micro-fished records, which you first have to identify the architect. Who knows the architects in residential buildings 50 years or older? When you go to the department, you have to first prove, this is a funny thing, and I'm saying that for the public to understand how difficult it is and what the challenges are for DBI as well as anybody who tries to do it the right way. You have to prove that the architect who built this building is dead. Otherwise, you will not be given the drawings. However, the history of how we do drawings has completely changed. So when I got my drawings 4 months later, and I happen to know how to look at drawings, I barely recognized my building because the requirements for how drawings are submitted today are completely different from what they were at that time. So long story short, to start with verifying it built and clarifying adjacencies and topography is something that needs to be brought into the practice, even if somebody who wants to do an alteration has to basically go through the effort to prove it. It is not just some kind of a finger in the wind interpretation, but it has to be based on tying the existing records together with what is being presented, and there's one of the biggest problems. What we have in planning when it comes to us looking at alterations, and there are different kinds of alterations which lead to de facto to demolitions, there are all kinds of ways of how they're described. And between the world in which this half of the room looks at drawings, and your world is basically a huge gap. Ours is there for entitlement. If it's reasonably described, it can be entitled, and there lies the problem. I sometimes ask additional questions because a drawing, because something looks strange. I say, by the way, does this really work? Well, this will be figured out later. But it's in the figured out later where the real trap lies. And that is, one, the devil in the details, but it's the reality or the true realities from general idea, which deals primarily with land use and workability, to livability and code compliance. And that is the chasm we fall into in terms of credibility, the public's trust. The public has to believe that planning and DBI work hand in hand, that it's basically a smoothly layered process, and it isn't. There's a huge gap, particularly when it comes to going into the field and figuring out that there are major portions of a building which really don't work anymore. The building paper, the weather insulation, the completely changed fire code, which kicks in when you have a major alteration, and. It's in that gap where I think the entire discussion falls apart, and I think we have to go back to the roots, I hate that word, to figure out of how planning approvals, entitlements, can be closer related to the reality of creating a livable, safe, compliant building. And we're at this moment not doing that. I think we're all operating with good intentions, but our intentions don't quite meet up. And it's not our fault because we are bad people, but the two practices are very, very different. This was a long sentence I needed to add here. I believe that the suggestion about finding and penalizing bad actors has to become a real enforcement element in how we look at real penalties. I agree with your thoughts on advanced inspections. I believe that a pre-application joint meeting with DBI may be incredibly necessary given the dwindling stock of homes which fall into the category that we're discussing today is getting increasingly smaller. We do see a very serious threat on the decrease on affordable housing, and only using those tools can we create more interactive mechanisms by which we are stronger in doing what we need to do. I spoke about, I believe that an interagency working group to deal with these issues would be a very, very strong thing to do that may be involving trusted structural, architectural, and other engineering professionals, because this gets very, very technical, and I appreciate the presentation by DBI to really show us that there are many things we just don't know. And I'm not talking to all of you, but I believe that many of us were pretty awed by Ms. Waddy's very thorough presentation, and we're easily slipping out of our area of expertise. And that is not a criticism, that is just a statement of fact. There was one idea, and I'm not quite sure if this is a moment for ideas, but if we are to establishing more stringent definitions and inspections, is there a possibility to look at a finer-grained definition of what alterations really are? Is there a possibility to distinguish between minor alterations, substantial alterations, and demolitions? And that is not when you take a whole building out, but when you are so close to changing a building that it starts to resemble demolitions. Perhaps the idea of the vertical and horizontal calculations that currently the department is using, that has perhaps today not proved effective anymore, perhaps finding a more subtle way by which we would look at different percentage ranges for the three types of alterations. We would be able to at least capture those which exceed those amounts that are now becoming critical when they move from entitlement into DBI. And that is, I think, the ones we are primarily talking about. They're the egregious ones, which basically saying, how could this happen? Ms. Sutish, for years and years and years, has shown them to us, and I think they are more in that latter range rather than in the simple kitchen, bathroom, whatever remodel. Not to talk about the kitchen remodel that Mr. Hugh pointed out. I am encouraged that we are all on a same page, similar page, same page, I don't know. But I look forward to working with you, and I do hope, and I'm addressing that to both directors, that the meeting frequency by which DBI can inform planning and planning can inform DBI becomes something which is part of standard city operation, together with the departments now with more linked websites work together.
Thank you, Commissioner Moore. Everything's, I think a lot of this has been said, so I won't reiterate a lot of what's been said, but I think, it's the rules are complicated. I don't think they have to be that complicated. I think we've made them overly complicated. I don't know if by design or not, but they work for those who kind of know the rules, but not for the general public. DBI's rules of demolition are vague, and I think plannings are overly kind of complicated and difficult to interpret. And there's that area between the two where you could be not a DBI demo, but a planning demo, which just doesn't make any sense. And these should be, the public should be able to look at a building and kind of understand whether it's a demo or not, and it's not clear. The building that somebody brought up where the two sidewalls are there, but you can see through it, that's not a demo from anybody's definitions. It just doesn't work. These have to kind of pass the logic test where I don't think they do. So I actually think the solutions to that are fairly easy to come up with. And I think both planning staff and DBI staff have started down paths. I've heard ideas from commissioners that can make that definition a lot easier. I think that the difficulty is then when do we discourage demolition, or when do we say it's okay to demo a building? And I think we certainly want to discourage it where it's a historic resource and it fits in with the neighborhood character. We want to discourage it if it's a multi-unit building that's subject to rent control. We tend not to see those, which I think is good. I think the city's done a good job of discouraging that already, but we've kind of uncovered buildings that are rent control that weren't in the plans or understood to be rent control. So we want to discourage those, but I think what we did during the much maligned residential expansion threshold discussion is we actually tried to encourage demo of non-historic, non-significant buildings where you could build more units, where you could build a 2-unit building and where there's a kind of a non-significant single-family home, or build a 3-unit building. And I think we should still do that. We should densify where the zoning allows for it, to not encourage a monster home, but actually encourage a multi-unit building, because that's going to be the affordable housing stock of the future. So I think there's elements of RET that we should pull back into this discussion. I agree that we need one definition of demo. There's too much gray area amongst this. I agree mostly with Ms. Shudish when she comes here. I think she's been great of kind of highlighting this issue. I don't know why you think, it'll be interesting to hear why you think there should be two definitions of demo. But I think one would be consistent, would be better for enforcement. It would be better for kind of setting forward policy goals. So I agree with everything that's been said on enforcement and penalties. And we should set a timeline to meet, whether it's a couple months from now or less, where we hear back from the group that's working on these issues, because I know Supervisor Peskin's been on it also, and kind of look to staff to come back, hold public meetings on this, get further input from those that have come here or those that haven't to testify on this issue, and come back with real solutions. So thank you all again for taking the time to do this, our fellow DBI commissioners, our commissioners, but most importantly, the members of the public who have come, and the staff who have put a lot of thought into this.
Thank you, President Hillis. Once again, thanks, fellow commissioners, and forgive me if I'm going to be repeating a lot of what we've already discussed, but I think it's important that I go on the record with a lot of that, particularly as President of the Building Commission over the years here. It's been a tough road on this whole issue. First of all, I'd like to thank both the secretaries for putting everybody here together today. I think this is one of the reasons we're getting on so well. We're so close to each other. I've never felt so close. So thank you for that. I know it's a big deal trying to put these together, so we appreciate it. Obviously, thank you for both departments, planning and DBI, for their presentation today and giving us that roadmap and insight into what the reality of what we're dealing with here, particularly with our demolition and our alteration codes. I mean, I knew this was going to be a very big meeting today, and it really is a very important big meeting. I don't think we've had, particularly in DBI, such an important meeting in many, many years. And to Commissioner Dennis Richards, you know, we should probably, it was 2 years, I think, was it 3 years? Four years, oh my, how time flies. And I think we should be more engaged and particularly pick topics that are troubling to the community, because we are here to serve. And to Commissioner Richard's point, it's our job to make sure that you feel comfortable with our policies and our procedures. I look around the room today, I see Mary Gallagher in here, and you know this is a big deal when she comes and talks. Calvin Welch is there. I was surprised Sue Hester didn't come up here. I mean, we're going back quite a many years here. So I really, really appreciate the comments and the testimony here today from everybody. The one particular comment, there was one particular speaker I felt was more interested in creating facts that didn't exist and was more interested in staying in the turmoil time that we're in. But I found that everybody else was in tune with whether you like it or dislike it, we need to do something. And trust was the word that was used, and it was used by Mary there, who's going through that. And I think the trust is broken, and I think we have an opportunity here to address it and fix it. I have some comments prepared that I think it's important that and once again, I apologise if I repeat myself, but the planning code and the building code are in conflict. We all agree on that. And with one another, and they create a series of confusing and frustrating situations for both the neighbours, planning and DBI, and the industry as a whole. And I think we've heard plenty of testimony to back that up here today. The planning code section 317, it is confusing. It's labour intensive, particularly to the planners and for them to implement. I think we've seen that in the presentations here today. There is often confusion in the field with the contractors and DBI inspectors trying to address, for example, the dry rot, waterproofing and other random uninspected field conditions while adhering to the current Demo Policy Planning Code of 317. And that was brought out, I think, particularly in the structural presentation here today. What it does is, to me, in my opinion, it creates many judgment calls for DBI inspectors who are stuck balancing 317 with other portions of the building code. And I think that's something we need to help them out with. And I know there's a lot of inspectors out there who feel very strongly. Some of them have 10, 15, 20 years in the field of dealing with this. Neighbours, and this is a big thing for me, and I think this is what a lot of the driven part of the complaints are, neighbours don't understand the difference between a demo and an alteration. And it's not their fault. It's just that complicated. We need to do more, and forgive me if this is a simplistic word, user-friendly, transparent system to distinguish the difference. And I'm hoping that with our working groups that will come out of that. The demo versus alteration in the planning process. Currently, there are two very different processes for these two types of projects. There is the market incentive to be an alteration, which I think is very apparent in a lot of the projects that run into trouble. It's easier for them to do an alteration than do a demo. If a project starts out as an alteration, but due to some unexpected field conditions become a demolition, there can be long delays in the project, and the sponsor will need to start the planning approval process all over again. It's just not making sense. Penalties, and this is where I get myself into a lot of trouble with people. I'm big on that the current penalty system is restrictive. It's not transparent to the public, and it doesn't adequately address the misrepresentation of plans, which we've talked about here today, which is a really big one, and it's a big one in my books. Project that demo beyond the scope of work, but is not considered demolition. A project sponsor who willfully chooses to illegally demolish a structure for financial gain, and that one has been apparent. It's been in the papers, and there's been a few bad actors out there, and I think they need to be addressed. The professional ethics part, The design teams must conduct business in a very high standard, and those who work product it's predictably inconsistent with the field conditions needed to be punished. I would, at this stage, I think to Commissioner Hillis's point that I think we should direct both our directors, I know of Director Huey, that if we could put a work group together and to a time frame that could work on some solutions and answers to this hearing today. And I don't know the time frame, and I'd lean towards staff. Is it 2 to 3 months that they would need for something like this? But I also think it's important to capture what Supervisor Peskin is trying to do as well legislatively, so that we could, within a timely fashion, give him some language that he could work and legislatively put this through the system. And so we can put this to bed once and for all and start out fresh and see how we do with a new policy and get rid of one that needs to go.
Great. So just in response to your question in terms of time, I think ballpark of 3 months would be a good starting point for us to be able to pull together a thoughtful, at least first stab at a proposal, working collectively city agencies. I think it would be helpful to have representation from the two commissions, working with Supervisor Peskin's office. I think we could certainly have something back before our commission goes on recess in August, that general time frame.
I think that works. And I think, sometimes we just throw out like a committee or a blue ribbon panel or something to solve this, which isn't going to solve it on its own. I think we've done processes where we elicit comment from everybody who's got a stake in this, whether it's the Pat Buskoviches of the world or the Georgia Shudiches, to really kind of formulate and start floating ideas. So again, I wouldn't wait till 3 months to kind of come back and present those ideas. I think we're encouraging to go out and talk through solutions to community groups or having meetings at the department so we get response and start to get some of the feedback and come back, with something that may not be final, but that we can kind of continue to hear and evolve. Commissioner Moore?
I'd like to ask Ms. Waddy or Mr. O'Riordan, at what time are we seeing our two computer systems more integrated? Because I think it would be a helpful tool to facilitate the process. I think we could be working directly into an understanding of that.
September is our
September.
go live. So
Okay.
maybe around that time we could come back and really.
And I want to stress, Commissioner Walker said that. I did not say that, okay?
Duly noted. Thank you.
September.
I understand the go-live date for Estella with DBI to be September 4th.
Commissioner Richards?
Just to reiterate, I think whatever we come up with, we need to make sure that we have the rent board's opinion, the assessor's office opinion, because there is a tax implication, a PUC fee implication, all that stuff on new construction. So that they're tuned into this as well as the city attorney for potential state law stuff.
Any other comment? Director Ram or Director Huey?
Just to thank everyone for coming. I know that there was one idea thrown out that I think Commissioner Melgar talked about, which was the idea of having one department. I'm very happy to report that Director Huey has volunteered to take on that job.
So we don't have to just pay for it, huh?
But thank you all for your comments today, and I think we'll organize a hearing within the time frame that you talked about, probably this summer.
Thank you. And certainly we can be updated as this moves along. We can hold an informational at the Planning Commission to get an update on where things are. DBI can do the same. So we look forward to that.
Yeah, I look forward to set a workforce within our department and planning, and then maybe give you any draft in advance, or we welcome one or two commission want to join us too to discuss. We have a little bit idea how to to do it, but right now, after the hearing, we heard about the Rambert situation and all those. Then we need to engage them into our equation.
Great. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. No, thank you for everybody. Thank you, Commissioners. Okay, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, eat lunch.
Guess we did.
o'clock?
reconvene at 1:45.
2 o'clock. Let's say
2
2 o'clock.
o'clock.